Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. There are places deep in the woods where you aren't supposed to go, where the trees grow too close and the air feels thick, almost like it's watching you. Places that belong to something else. I learned that the hard way. It was last fall when my girlfriend Emily and I decided to take a weekend camping trip. The stress of our jobs had been getting to us, and we wanted a break, a quiet escape into nature. We'd always loved hiking, and this time we chose a trail off the beaten path, far from the usual tourist spots. Emily had found the location on some obscure online forum, a place called Dead Man's Ridge. The name alone should have been a red flag. We packed our gear, drove out, and arrived at the trailhead by mid-morning. There was no one else around, just miles of thick forest and an eerie silence that settled over the area. It was strange. No birds, no wind, not even the sound of distant wildlife. Just quiet. As we started hiking, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I chalked it up to nerves. We were far from civilization, and the solitude was unnerving. But as we went deeper into the forest, the feeling only grew stronger. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches twisting and curling in unnatural ways. About 2 hours in, we came across a clearing with an old, weathered wooden sign nailed to a tree. The words were barely legible, worn down by time and the elements, but we could just make out the message. "Do not enter after dark." Emily laughed it off. A creepy old sign, huh? Probably some local superstition. I didn't laugh. Something about the sign felt wrong. But Emily was already pushing forward, so I followed, trying to ignore the growing knot in my stomach. We found a spot to set up camp just before dusk, a little flat area surrounded by towering pines. By the time we had the tent pitched and the fire going, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the forest was bathed in the dull orange glow of the dying light. That's when things started to feel different. The air grew colder, more than it should have, and the quiet intensified. The crackling of the fire was the only sound around us. I could feel the weight of the woods pressing in, the sense that something was out there, lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. We were eating dinner when we first heard it, this distant rhythmic sound, like someone banging on wood. Thunk, thunk, thunk. It echoed through the trees, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. "What is that?" I asked, glancing over at Emily. Her face had gone pale. "I don't know," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the fire. "Maybe it's just a tree falling." But I could tell she didn't believe that, neither did I. The sound continued, growing louder, closer. Thunk, thunk, thunk. "We should check it out," Emily said, but there was no conviction in her voice. I wasn't about to go wandering into the dark over some creepy noise, and I told her so. We agreed to stay by the fire, let whatever it was pass. But it didn't pass. It stopped. Dead silence again, so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. We waited, tense, eyes scanning the shadows. That's when we saw it. A figure just at the edge of the firelight. At first it looked like a man, standing perfectly still between two trees watching us. But the longer I stared, the more wrong it looked. Its arms were too long, its posture hunched, head tilted at an unnatural angle. And then it moved, just slightly. A subtle shift, like it was testing whether we'd noticed it. I froze, unable to speak, barely able to breathe. I didn't dare look away. "Do you see that?" I finally whispered. Emily didn't respond. She was already standing, backing away from the fire, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As if in response, the figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. I still couldn't make out its face, but its outline. It was all wrong. It wasn't human. Without another word, we grabbed our bags and bolted, running blindly into the woods. We didn't stop to pack up the tent, didn't stop to think. We just ran. The woods were a blur around us, trees rushing past as we sprinted through the darkness. Behind us I could hear it, the sound of branches snapping, leaves crunching, something chasing us. It was fast, too fast. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. Finally, after what felt like hours, we stumbled into another clearing, collapsing against a large boulder. We were panting, gasping for air, trying to catch our breath. The forest around us was silent again. But the feeling of being watched, it was still there, stronger than ever. What the hell was that? I managed to choke out between gasps. Emily didn't answer right away. She was staring at something just beyond the clearing, eyes wide with terror. Slowly, I turned to follow her gaze. At first, I didn't see anything, just trees and shadows. But then, as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing among the trees, watching us. They were tall, too tall, their limbs unnaturally long, their faces hidden in shadow. "We have to go," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. But when we turned to leave, we found ourselves face to face with another figure, closer this time. It stood in the middle of the clearing, directly in our path. Its eyes, they were wrong, hollow, empty. Why is this happening?" I stammered, backing away. And then it spoke. Its voice was like the rustling of dead leaves, dry and ancient. "You were warned," it said, its mouth curling into a grotesque smile, though its eyes remained dark. "The woods don't take kindly to trespassers." Emily grabbed my arm and we bolted again, not caring where we were going, just needing to get away. But the forest was endless, a labyrinth of trees and shadows that seemed to stretch on forever. No matter how far we ran, we couldn't find the trail, couldn't find the road. We were trapped. By the time the sun began to rise, we had collapsed in exhaustion, too tired to move, too scared to sleep. When we finally did make it out, if we ever really did, it wasn't to the same world. The woods don't just let you leave. They take something from you. We never found our way back to the car. We never found the campsite again. And sometimes late at night I can still hear it, the thunk, 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 echoing in my ears. The worst part? The photo on my phone, taken just before we ran. In it, you can see Emily and me smiling by the fire, and behind us, at the edge of the clearing, the first figure, watching. I always loved camping in the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest. There's a quiet there that feels ancient, like you're stepping back into a time when the world was raw and wild. I thought I knew those woods, every trail, every hidden grove. But last summer, I stumbled into something that I still can't explain. I had heard about a remote spot called Fogwater Ridge, a place supposedly untouched by humans, off any map, buried deep in the forest's heart. A fellow camper told me it was beautiful, a little eerie, but worth the trip. It was exactly what I was looking for, solitude, isolation, and nature in its purest form. I packed up and headed out one Friday morning. It took hours just to reach the dirt road that would lead me to the trailhead, and another few hours of hiking through dense, overgrown paths before I finally saw it. Fogwater Ridge. The trees here were older, their bark blackened and gnarled, as though they had weathered countless storms, and true to its name, a thick fog clung to the ground, swirling around the trees and muting every sound. Even the air felt different, heavier, colder. But I wasn't deterred. If anything, I was intrigued. I set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines that stretched so high they seemed to disappear into the fog. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of the trees in the wind, though there wasn't much of that. Everything felt still, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Nightfall came quicker than I expected. One moment the sky was a dusky gray, and the next, darkness swallowed the woods whole. I built a fire, the flames casting flickering shadows that danced along the edge of the clearing. But the fog didn't retreat. It seemed to grow thicker, pressing in closer to the light like a living thing. I sat there eating dinner, staring into the flames when I first heard it. A rustling, faint and distant, but unmistakable. I froze, listening. The sound grew louder, like something large was moving through the underbrush, just beyond the reach of my firelight. Probably just a deer, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the sudden unease creeping up my spine. But the noise didn't stop. It circled the camp, slow and deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it into the trees, but the beam barely pierced the thick fog. Still, I saw nothing. The rustling continued, now accompanied by the distinct sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, like something walking upright. I stood up, knife in hand, flashlight shaking in the other. "Who's out there?" I shouted into the darkness. "Show yourself!" Nothing answered, but the footsteps stopped. I waited, listening, my heart pounding in my ears. After a few moments, the silence returned, thick and oppressive. I slowly backed up to the fire, telling myself it was probably just an animal, maybe an elk or a bear, though I knew the sound was wrong, too human. I decided to call it a night, though sleep felt impossible. I crawled into my tent, keeping the knife close and the flashlight even closer. The fire outside crackled softly, but the fog seemed to muffle even that sound, like the world was closing in. Sometime in the dead of night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had stirred me, maybe the cold or the weight of that strange silence. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were closer. Much closer. Something was walking just outside my tent. I held my breath, listening as the footsteps moved around me, slow and deliberate. They stopped right at the entrance to the tent. My heart raced. I could hear breathing, deep, raspy, as if something was right on the other side of the canvas. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I reached for my flashlight and turned it on. The beam shot through the thin fabric of the tent, casting shadows in the fog outside. But there was nothing there. No outline, no figure. Just the mist, thick and swirling. I exhaled shakily, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe I was still half asleep. Maybe it was just an animal passing by. Then I heard it. A whisper. Faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Not alone. I bolted upright, my blood turning to ice. The whisper didn't come from outside. It came from inside the tent. I scrambled out of the sleeping bag, flashlight whipping around the small space, but there was nothing. Just me, alone. The footsteps resumed, louder now, circling the tent, faster and more erratic. I could hear something brushing against the fabric, something solid, dragging its fingers or claws along the outside. And then it stopped. Everything went silent again. But the tension was unbearable, like something was waiting just beyond the walls of my tent. The air was thick, oppressive, and that strange fog outside seemed to creep closer, pushing against the fabric. Suddenly, the fire outside went out. Just snuff it out, leaving me in complete darkness. My breath caught in my throat, and I knew I had to get out of there. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human, and it wasn't friendly. I grabbed my pack, threw on my boots, and burst out of the tent, ready to make a run for it. But when I stepped into the clearing, I froze. The fog was everywhere, thick as smoke. But worse than that, there were eyes. Dozens of them, glowing a sickly yellow in the dark, staring at me from the trees. They didn't blink, they didn't move, just stared. My skin prickled with fear, and every instinct screamed at me to run. But my legs wouldn't work. The eyes seemed to multiply, appearing between the trees, closer and closer, surrounding me. And then, out of the fog, they stepped forward. Tall figures, hunched and grotesque, their limbs too long, their bodies covered in matted fur or something like it. But their faces were almost human, almost. except for those wide, glowing eyes and the way their mouths stretched into twisted, unnatural grins. I stumbled back, barely able to breathe. They didn't make a sound, just watched me, their heads cocked to the side as if curious. And then, one of them stepped forward, reaching out a long, gnarled hand. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until the sun broke through the fog hours later, and I reached my car, drenched in sweat and fear. I never went back to Fogwater Ridge, but sometimes on cold, quiet nights when the fog rolls in heavy, I swear I can still see them, those glowing eyes watching from the mist, and I know they're waiting. I've always loved the isolation of the wilderness. No distractions, no noise, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the crackling of the campfire. But I'll never go back after what happened last fall. It started as a simple trip, a weekend alone, camping in Cedar Hollow, a forest so remote you have to hike several miles from the nearest trailhead just to get to the heart of it. Perfect, I thought. No cell service, no people, just me and nature. I'd been to Cedar Hollow before, but this time I was pushing further, deeper into the forest. I wanted real solitude, to feel the weight of the wilderness pressing in on me. When I arrived at the trailhead that afternoon, the parking lot was empty, not a single other car. Good, I thought, I was truly alone. The hike in was uneventful at first, just the usual sights and sounds of the forest. But as the sun started to set, the atmosphere shifted. The woods got darker faster than I expected, and the silence, there's something about it that feels different when you're that deep in. Not peaceful, not serene, just still. Too still. I set up camp beside a small clearing, the trees around me towering like ancient guardians. I had enough daylight left to gather firewood, and soon enough I had a small fire going. As the flames crackled and danced, I settled into my chair and tried to relax. But something was bothering me. That eerie stillness. No birds, no rustling in the bushes. Even the wind seemed to have died. An hour later, I was still feeling uneasy, but I couldn't put my finger on why. I kept glancing into the trees, thinking I saw movement just beyond the firelight, shadows darting between the trunks. But every time I looked closer, there was nothing. That's when I heard the first sound. It was distant, faint, almost like a scream, but too far off to be sure. I brushed it off. Probably an animal. Mountain lions, maybe. They make weird sounds sometimes, right? I tried to ignore it, but the uneasy feeling grew. There was something out there. I could feel it. My fire felt too small, like it couldn't hold back the darkness that was pressing in. I kept scanning the trees, waiting for some shape to emerge. Then the snap of a branch. Close. I shot up from my chair, gripping my flashlight. I pointed it toward the noise, but the beam barely cut through the thick night. Just trees, more shadows. I listened intently, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. They were slow, almost as if something, or someone, was trying to sneak up on me. But they were unmistakable. The crunch of leaves, the snapping of twigs. They circled the camp just outside the reach of the firelight, never coming into view. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" Silence. I took a deep breath and tried to steady my nerves. Maybe it was just an animal. But the pattern of those steps. No animal walks like that. Too deliberate. Too measured. And then the smell hit me. A rancid, overpowering stench, like something rotting. It drifted in with the wind, and I gagged, covering my mouth. The fire popped and hissed, struggling to stay lit as the air grew colder, unnaturally cold. I backed toward the fire, shining my flashlight into the trees. The footsteps had stopped, but the stench remained, thick and cloying. And then I saw it, just at the edge of my light, a figure standing between the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its limbs were all wrong, too long, too thin, like it had been stretched. Its skin, if you could call it that, was pale, almost translucent, clinging to bones that jutted out in sharp angles. Its face, God, I still can't describe it fully. It was like it had a face, but it didn't at the same time. A featureless, gaping expanse. I stumbled backward, nearly falling into the fire, but when I looked again, it was gone. I stood there, heart racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. But before I could even process it, I heard another noise, this time from behind me. I spun around, my flashlight flickering. There, at the edge of the clearing, was another figure. This one was crouched low on all fours, its glowing eyes fixed on me. I couldn't move, I was trapped, surrounded. Then, out of nowhere, a man stepped into the clearing. He wore a park ranger uniform, his face shadowed by his hat. Relief flooded through me for a split second. But as he got closer, I realized something was wrong. His movements were too stiff, too mechanical, like he wasn't fully in control of his own body. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. "There's something out there," I stammered, pointing to where the creatures had been. He didn't even glance that way. Instead, he just stared at me, unblinking. "It's too late." "What? What do you mean?" Before he could answer, the forest around us exploded with sound. Footsteps, hundreds of them, all rushing toward us from every direction. I turned to run, but the ranger grabbed my arm with an iron grip. "You can't leave," he hissed, his voice distorting, deepening into something that didn't sound human. I yanked my arm free and ran into the trees, heart hammering in my chest. Behind me, I could hear the ranger's voice, but it wasn't just his voice anymore. It was layered, like multiple people speaking through him, all saying the same thing over and over. "You can't leave." I ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the direction, just desperate to get away. But no matter how far I went, I could hear them, the footsteps, the whispers, the heavy breathing closing in around me. Eventually, I burst out of the trees and onto a dirt road. My car was parked just ahead, right where I'd left it. I sprinted to it, fumbling for my keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I slammed it shut and locked it, gasping for breath. For a moment, everything was silent, no footsteps, no whispers. But then, from the edge of the woods, I saw the ranger again. He stood there just watching, his face twisted into that same unsettling grin. I floored the gas pedal and didn't look back until I was miles away, the trees shrinking in the rearview mirror. When I finally got home, I tried to report what happened, but Cedar Hollow, they told me, had been closed for months. No park rangers, no visitors. It was off limits after a series of strange disappearances. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know what was stalking me or what that ranger really was. But I can still smell that stench sometimes in my nightmares, and I can still hear those footsteps getting closer. And I know one thing for certain, whatever's out there in Cedar Hollow, it's waiting. I didn't believe the stories at first. They were always passed around like folklore, a way to scare the tourists or keep teenagers from sneaking into the woods at night. The Pale Ones, they called them. Rangers whispered about them when they thought no one was listening, the ones that had been working in the forest long enough to see strange things. Still, I brushed it off. I was skeptical, always had been. Cryptids, ghosts, skinwalkers, just stuff to tell around a campfire. That changed last summer. My girlfriend Katie and I had decided to take a weekend trip to one of the more secluded campgrounds in the area. We both loved the outdoors, and the idea of being far from any other campers appealed to us. The place was a good hour's hike from where we parked the car, deep in the heart of the forest, away from the crowds and noise of the main sights. It was perfect, or at least it seemed that way. We arrived late afternoon, the sun already low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. The trees out here were ancient, towering over us like silent giants. The air was thick, cooler than it had been when we first arrived. I set up the tent while Katie gathered firewood, the quietness of the woods settling around us. The only sound was the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional crack of a branch breaking underfoot. As dusk fell, the woods seemed to come alive in a way I hadn't expected. The silence became oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. The fire crackled weakly, barely enough to push back the encroaching darkness. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement just beyond the reach of the firelight. Shadows shifting, trees bending. But when I looked directly, nothing was there. Katie was the first to bring it up. "Do you feel weird?" she asked, her voice unusually quiet. "Weird how?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, though the unease had already started crawling under my skin. "I don't know, it's just the air. It feels heavy, like we're being watched." I laughed it off, but in truth I'd been feeling it too. That prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like a pair of unseen eyes were trained on us. I told her it was probably just the isolation getting to us. After all, it's easy to get spooked when you're this far from civilization. But that night, as we lay in the tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The wind had picked up, making the trees sway and creak like old bones. Katie had fallen asleep, her breath slow and steady beside me, but I lay there, eyes open, listening to the forest. It was then I heard it. A distant hum, so faint it was almost a vibration more than a sound. At first I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. It was too rhythmic, too precise. It seemed to rise and fall, like something was out there humming an eerie, tuneless melody. I sat up, listening, my heart racing. The hum was coming closer. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, not wanting to wake Katie, and stepped out into the night. The fire had long since died, leaving the campsite shrouded in darkness. I shone my flashlight into the woods, the beam cutting through the black, but all I saw were trees, tall, thin, their branches bending unnaturally in the wind. Then, just at the edge of the light, something moved. At first I thought it was a deer, tall with long limbs, but the way it moved was wrong. Its body was too thin, almost skeletal, its limbs too long and spindly. It moved with a jerky, unnatural grace, like it wasn't used to walking on two legs. And then I saw its face, or rather the absence of one. Pale, smooth skin stretched over a featureless skull. No eyes, no mouth, just blankness where a face should be. I gasped, stumbling back, my flashlight flickering. The thing stopped, its head tilting in my direction, though there was no way it could see me. That humming grew louder, vibrating in my chest, filling my ears. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to think. And then it vanished, melting back into the trees. I don't remember how long I stood there, my heart hammering in my chest. It could have been seconds, minutes, I don't know. All I knew was that whatever that thing was, it was still out there. I bolted back into the tent, shaking Katie awake. "We have to go," I whispered, my voice hoarse with fear. "We need to leave. Now." "What are you talking about?" she mumbled, still half asleep. "I saw something. It's not safe here." She sat up, confused, but the urgency in my voice must have gotten through to her. We packed up as quickly as we could, grabbing what we needed and leaving the rest. The entire time I kept my flashlight pointed toward the woods, half expecting to see that thing again, its featureless face watching us. We started hiking back toward the car, the darkness pressing in on us from all sides. The humming had stopped, but the forest still felt wrong, like it was holding something back, something just out of sight. After about an hour of walking in tense silence, Katie stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I listened. At first I heard nothing, but then a faint sound like something, was imitating our footsteps. Every time we took a step, there was an echo just behind us. A step, a pause, a step. My blood ran cold. We quickened our pace, but so did the sound, matching our speed exactly. I didn't dare look back. Then Katie screamed, and I spun around, my flashlight whipping through the darkness, and saw it, the pale one. It was crouching just feet away from us, its elongated body twisted in an unnatural position, its blank face tilted toward us. The humming began again, louder, almost deafening. Without thinking, I grabbed Katie's hand and we ran, sprinting through the underbrush, branches slashing at our faces and arms. The humming grew louder, more frantic, as if it was inside my head now, pulsing with every heartbeat. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to unlock the door. We threw ourselves inside, slamming the doors shut, and I floored the gas, not daring to look back. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away from the forest, the humming still ringing in my ears. We never reported it. Who would believe us? The stories about the pale ones are just that. Stories. But I know what I saw. I know what followed us out of those woods. And sometimes late at night when the wind howls through the trees, I swear I can still hear the hum. It started as a simple camping trip. Just me, my best friend Jake, and the vast sprawling woods stretching out before us. We'd done this a few times before. Camping trips deep into the forest where we could forget about the noise of the city and disconnect for a few days. There was something about the isolation that was freeing. We picked a spot far off the beaten path, deep into the forest, where even the birds seemed quieter, like the world was holding its breath. The sun was setting as we set up camp, painting the sky in deep reds and purples that melted into the looming silhouettes of the trees. Jake and I joked about ghost stories, trying to creep each other out. The truth was, I never put much stock in that kind of thing, but out here in the fading light, everything felt different. The trees were tall and gnarled, their branches twisting like skeletal hands. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the forest floor, and every little sound seemed magnified. We built a fire, its crackling the only thing keeping the silence at bay, and settled in for the night. That's when things started to feel off. It was subtle at first, a rustling sound, just beyond the fire's light, in the underbrush. Not unusual. Wildlife is everywhere out here. But this rustling was steady, deliberate, like something was watching, pacing just out of view. Jake must have noticed too, because he grew quiet, his eyes scanning the darkness. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, straining my ears to catch the sound again. But it was gone, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the occasional crack of wood in the fire. "Probably a deer," I muttered, trying to shake off the creeping unease. But it wasn't a deer. As the night deepened, so did the strange occurrences. Every so often I'd catch something in the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement between the trees, too fast to focus on. I told myself it was just the shadows playing tricks on me, but my heart rate was starting to quicken. The forest was growing unnervingly still. The wind had died down, and even the crickets seemed quieter. The fire's glow felt like a fragile barrier between us and the dark. Then came the smell, a rancid metallic stench wafted in from somewhere beyond the campsite, so thick and pungent that it made my stomach turn. It wasn't the smell of decay. It was sharper, more acrid, like burning meat mixed with copper. "Jake, you smell that?" I asked, covering my nose. He nodded, looking around nervously. Maybe something died out there. But it didn't smell like any dead animal I'd ever encountered. It smelled wrong. We decided to call it a night, hoping sleep would put our minds at ease. I crawled into my tent, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was watching us, something just out of sight, waiting. The sound of the forest was deafening in its absence. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, nothing but the occasional crackle from the fire outside. And then I heard it, a voice, soft, barely audible but unmistakable. It was Jake's voice, coming from just outside my tent. "Come out here, I need your help," he whispered. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen. The voice sounded off, distorted, like it was coming through a broken radio. But it was Jake's voice. No mistaking that. "Jake," I whispered back. "What's going on?" There was a long pause and then, "Come outside. I'm hurt." My gut twisted. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. I unzipped my tent just a few inches, peeking out, expecting to see Jake standing there. But the fire was still burning low, casting flickering light on the empty clearing. Jake wasn't there. Panic gripped me. I scrambled out of my tent and hurried to his, yanking open the flap. Jake was inside, fast asleep, his face calm, his breath slow and even. I backed away, confusion flooding my mind. What the hell? My heart hammered against my ribs as I stood there, staring down at him. Had I imagined the voice? No. I heard it. I know I did. That's when I saw it. Movement at the edge of the trees. Something tall, hunched over, just beyond the fire's reach. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to focus, but the thing was gone, swallowed by the darkness as soon as I spotted it. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. The voice came again. Help me. This time it wasn't Jake's voice, it was mine. The blood drained from my face. My legs felt weak, like they might give out at any moment. The voice, my voice, was coming from deeper in the woods now, echoing between the trees. Help me, I'm lost. I backed away, my skin crawling. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. I turned to wake Jake, but before I could, the fire flickered violently, as if hit by a gust of wind. A shadow passed over the campsite, something large shifting just outside the circle of light. The smell returned, stronger this time. Burning meat, copper. I looked up, and there, standing at the edge of the woods, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its joints bending the wrong way. The thing's skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, it had no eyes. Just empty, hollow sockets staring back at me. It opened its mouth, and my voice spilled out again, warped and broken. Help me, I'm hurt. The thing stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it wasn't used to walking. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. This thing, this creature, was wearing my voice, twisting it into something grotesque. Behind me, Jake stirred, sitting up groggily. What's going on? I opened my mouth to answer, but the creature's voice echoed louder now, overlapping with my own, filling the clearing. Help me. I'm lost. Jake's eyes widened as he saw the thing. He scrambled to his feet, his face pale with terror. What the hell is that? I grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the car, but the thing was faster. It moved in jerking bursts, its limbs contorting as it closed the distance. My mind screamed for us to run, but my legs felt like lead. The creature's hollow gaze locked onto us, and in that moment, I knew we weren't going to make it. But then it stopped. It stood there, towering over us, breathing heavily as if it were waiting. And then it smiled, not with its mouth, but with mine. I screamed, but the sound that came out wasn't my own, it was Jake's. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to believe in the things that go bump in the night. You know, the kinds of stories people tell around a campfire just to freak you out. But after what I experienced last fall in the backwoods of Colorado, I'm not so sure anymore. In fact, I don't think I'll ever sleep easily again. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, just me, my buddy Marcus, and his younger brother Danny. We'd packed light, drove far, and trekked deep into the isolated woods of a national forest. You see, we weren't interested in crowded campgrounds with RVs and screaming kids. We wanted something wild, something untouched. And we got it. The first day was normal, even peaceful. We set up camp near a creek and spent the afternoon fishing. The only sounds were the wind threading through the trees and the soft trickle of water. But as evening crept in, that peaceful silence became something else. It was like the forest was holding its breath. There were no birds, no insects, nothing. We should have taken that as a sign. We lit a fire just as the last sliver of daylight disappeared. Marcus joked about the lack of wildlife, calling it prime Bigfoot territory. Danny, of course, laughed it off, and I chuckled too, but something about that joke made my skin crawl. I didn't say anything, though. We were miles from anyone, maybe miles from anything, and that isolation was starting to feel a little too real. That's when the first howl pierced through the trees. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. It was high-pitched, like a scream, but guttural, as if something massive was forcing it out of its throat. We all froze, eyes wide, listening. It came again, closer this time, echoing through the trees. Marcus laughed nervously. Must be a coyote. But there was no confidence in his voice. Coyotes don't sound like that. Another howl, this one even closer. The fire flickered, and I swear for a second, the shadows it cast seemed to stretch unnaturally far into the woods, twisting and writhing like living things. "We should get inside the tent," Danny suggested, his voice tight. Marcus shook his head, trying to maintain the bravado, but I could see it in his eyes. He was scared too. We packed up the food and doused the fire, the darkness rushing in around us like ink. I've never felt anything as oppressive as that night. As we zipped up the tent, another sound came, a rustling in the underbrush not 20 feet away. It was a rhythmic sound, heavy, like something large moving deliberately through the forest. We held our breath, straining to hear. The footsteps were deliberate, slow, like it knew we were listening. Then, silence. I mouthed to Marcus, "What was that?" But he only shook his head. That's when the scratching began. Something was dragging its claws across the tent fabric, light at first, then harder, like it was testing the strength of the material. Danny whimpered, and Marcus shot him a look, telling him to be quiet. But honestly, I didn't blame the kid. I felt like screaming too. Then came the voice. It was faint but clear, my own name. Jake. It sounded off, though, like someone who'd never spoken before was trying to say it for the first time. It echoed around us, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. My heart pounded so loud I could barely hear anything else, but then it came again. Ack! It wasn't Marcus, and it definitely wasn't Danny. Both of them were staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. My mouth went dry and my mind raced. How could someone know my name? We were miles from civilization, and no one knew where we were. That's when the tent started to collapse. Something or someone was pushing down on it from all sides. I could hear the fabric stretching, the poles bending. Marcus fumbled with his flashlight, but the beam flickered weakly, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to warp in the light. There was movement outside, faster now, circling us, accompanied by a low growl that seemed to vibrate the very ground. The tent collapsed entirely, and in a blind panic we scrambled out, hearts hammering. I'll never forget the sight that greeted us outside. The moon was high, but the light was faint, barely illuminating the clearing, and there, standing at the edge of the trees, were figures, not people, not animals, shadows, twisted and elongated, their shapes bending unnaturally in the moonlight. They had the vague outline of humans, but their limbs were wrong, too long, too thin. Their faces, or what I could make out of them, were hollow, empty, just dark voids where eyes should have been. And they were watching us. Marcus whispered under his breath, "What the hell are those things?" But none of us moved. We couldn't. The air felt thick, like moving through syrup. One of the figures stepped forward, and as it did, the trees seemed to bend away from it like they were recoiling. Its head tilted, and I heard it again. The voice, this time louder, more distorted. Jake. It came from its mouth, if you could call it that. And then, like a nightmare turned real, the thing mimicked Danny's voice. "Danny." We bolted. We didn't think, didn't grab our things. We just ran, crashing through the woods, branches whipping at our faces. Behind us, I could hear them following. No footsteps, just the crackling of leaves and the whisper of voices, all saying our names over and over. We ran for what felt like hours, but the voices never faded. They stayed right on our heels, never closer, never farther. When we finally reached the car, I didn't even remember unlocking it. We just jumped in and sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. It wasn't until we hit the highway that the voices stopped. No one spoke for the entire drive back to town. It was like if we talked about it, we'd make it real again. Here's the thing. When we went back a week later with the park rangers, they found our campsite, but they didn't find our tent. They didn't find our bags or the fire pit or anything. What they did find was footprints, massive, human-like, but distorted. They circled the area in impossible patterns, overlapping as if whatever made them had no regard for physical space. And the trees. The bark was shredded like something had clawed at them with unnatural force. That was the last time I set foot in the woods, and now, every night, just before I fall asleep, I swear I hear it again. That voice, calling my name. Jackie. And I don't know how much longer I can ignore it. I never used to believe the old stories about the woods near Pine Hollow. The locals in the nearby town loved to tell them, legends passed down from one generation to the next. They'd warn anyone who would listen. Don't go too deep into those woods after dark, or the forest has eyes and they don't like to be watched. It sounded like classic small-town folklore, meant to scare off tourists or keep kids from wandering too far. As someone who had grown up camping and hiking, I'd heard my fair share of spooky stories, and none of them had ever stopped me before. So when I found out about a remote spot deep in Pine Hollow that was perfect for camping, I didn't hesitate. I planned the trip carefully. I was going solo, just the way I liked it. One night, deep in the woods, far from anyone else. The area I was heading to was known for its dense pines and rocky hills, and there was a small lake that I'd camp beside. Peaceful, quiet, exactly what I needed after months of stress from work. The hike in was beautiful. Tall trees loomed overhead, the smell of pine needles and earth filling the air. I'd never been in a forest so thick. The trees seemed to go on forever, and the trail quickly disappeared behind me. It was like stepping into another world, one untouched by time. After a few hours of hiking, I found the perfect spot. A flat area near the lake with a view of the water. The reflection of the trees on the surface was calm, undisturbed. I set up my tent, built a fire, and spent the rest of the afternoon fishing and enjoying the silence. Not a soul in sight. Just me, the trees, and the water. As dusk settled in, I felt a creeping chill in the air. The temperature dropped faster than I expected, so I threw more wood on the fire and settled in with a book. But as the night grew darker, I started noticing something strange. The usual sounds of the forest, the birds, the rustling leaves were absent. It was unnaturally quiet. That's when I first felt it, a sensation like being watched. It was subtle at first, but the longer I sat by the fire, the stronger it grew. I found myself glancing around, peering into the shadows beyond the firelight. The trees, so tall and dense, now seemed oppressive, like they were closing in. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I'd been camping solo countless times before, and I knew the feeling of being alone in the wilderness could sometimes mess with your head. But then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. At first I thought it was something natural, a branch swaying in the wind or maybe a distant woodpecker. But the tapping wasn't random. It was steady, deliberate, like someone knocking on wood. I stood up, flashlight in hand, and shone it into the darkness. The beam barely penetrated the thick trees. The sound seemed to be coming from the forest behind me, away from the lake. I waited, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping stopped. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, but there was nothing. Just the trees, standing tall and still, their shadows long and dark in the firelight. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. It's just the woods, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. I sat back down by the fire, but the feeling of being watched never went away. It grew stronger, more oppressive. Every time I turned to look at the trees, I expected to see something or someone standing there watching me from the darkness. It wasn't long before I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped myself into my sleeping bag. But sleep didn't come. The tapping sound returned, louder this time, closer. It was as if someone was circling my campsite, knocking on the trees as they went. My mind raced through possibilities. It had to be an animal, or maybe a trick of the wind. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the sense that something was out there, something that didn't belong. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the tapping stopped. Silence fell over the forest again, but this time it felt suffocating. My breath was shallow, and I lay there perfectly still, listening for any sign of movement. That's when I heard the breathing, soft, ragged breaths, just outside the tent. I froze. The sound was unmistakable. Something was standing right outside, just feet from where I lay. I could hear it shifting, the faint crunch of leaves underfoot, the slow, deliberate inhalation and exhalation. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand shaking as I clicked it on and pointed it toward the tent flap. I wasn't sure what I expected to see, but when the beam of light cut through the darkness, there was nothing, just the empty clearing and the stillness of the night. But the breathing didn't stop. It grew louder, more strained, like it was coming from everywhere at once. I turned the flashlight in every direction, but there was no one there. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but nothing about the situation made any sense. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, the air in the tent suddenly feeling too thin. And then, from the darkness, came a voice, a low, rasping whisper. "Leave." My blood ran cold. The voice sounded like it came from right behind me, just beyond the thin fabric of the tent. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my hand, but again, nothing. "Leave," the voice repeated, closer this time. I didn't need to be told again. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, grabbed my gear, and burst out of the tent, heart racing. The night was eerily still, the forest around me dark and quiet. I didn't stop to pack anything else. I just grabbed my pack and bolted. As I ran, the voice followed me, always just behind me, whispering, urging me to go faster. "Leave." I tore through the forest, the trees blurring in my peripheral vision. Branches scratched at my arms and face, but I didn't care. All I could think about was putting as much distance between myself and that campsite as possible. I didn't stop until I reached the main trail, gasping for breath, my legs burning from the effort. When I finally looked back, there was nothing behind me. No shadows, no voices, no figures lurking in the trees, just the quiet, empty forest. I made it back to my car just as dawn was breaking. Exhausted and shaken, I threw my gear in the back seat and drove away without looking back. I haven't been back to Pine Hollow since, and I don't plan to. The locals still tell their stories, and I guess now I believe them. The forest has eyes, they say, and whatever watches from those trees doesn't like to be disturbed. I should have listened to my gut. The second we parked the car at the trailhead, something felt wrong, but it was late, and the rest of the group, Mia, Sam, and Jason, were all buzzing with excitement for the trip. We'd been planning this weekend for months, a 2-night camping trip deep in the untouched woods of Blackwater Forest. No cell service, no people, just pure isolation. Perfect, right? We should have turned back. By the time we set up camp, the sun was dipping below the tree line, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. The air was cool, but something about it felt thick, almost like it was suffocating, hanging around us like the woods themselves were waiting for something. The first night was calm, for the most part. We laughed around the campfire, told ghost stories, the usual. But when the fire started dying down, the woods around us grew unnervingly silent. Not just the normal quiet of a remote forest, but a complete and unnatural stillness. No insects buzzing, no leaves rustling. Just nothing. "I don't like this," Mia had whispered, staring into the trees. "It's too quiet." Jason, always the skeptic, chuckled and tossed another log onto the fire. "Come on, it's just nature. No wolves or bears out here. Relax." But I couldn't shake it. My senses were on edge, like every part of me was tuned in to something that wasn't there, or at least something I couldn't see. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I don't know what stirred me, maybe a noise, maybe the cold. But when I opened my eyes, I felt that thick, oppressive feeling again. My tent was zipped shut, but I could feel it. Something was out there, just beyond the nylon wall, watching. Then I heard it, a faint shuffling sound, slow, deliberate, like footsteps. It wasn't an animal, at least not any I recognized. The steps were too measured, too heavy. I held my breath, every instinct in me screaming to stay silent. The sound circled the tent, moving closer, and then stopped right outside. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen, but eventually the footsteps retreated, disappearing into the night. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I told the others about the footsteps. Sam, always the logical one, tried to explain it away as an animal. Maybe it was a deer or a boar, he said, shrugging. But Mia's eyes met mine, and I could tell she didn't buy it. She had heard it too. We both had. That day we hiked deeper into the woods, following an old trail that barely seemed to exist anymore. It felt like we were walking into another world, the trees growing denser, the light filtering through the canopy in thin, sickly beams. As we walked, I noticed something strange. There were markings on the trees, not carvings or scratches, but symbols. Odd, jagged shapes that made my skin crawl just looking at them. When I pointed them out to the others, Sam shrugged again, dismissing it as old Native American stuff. But I knew better. These weren't relics of the past. They were recent, fresh. By the time we reached a clearing, the sun was starting to dip again, and the air felt even heavier than before. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not just watched, followed. I kept glancing back, expecting to see something between the trees. A shadow, a figure. But there was nothing, only that suffocating stillness. We set up camp in the clearing, and that's when things really started to go wrong. It was Mia who saw it first. She had wandered off to collect firewood and came running back, pale and breathless. "There's something in the woods," she gasped, pointing frantically behind her. It looked like a person, but it wasn't." "What do you mean, wasn't?" Jason asked, laughing nervously. "You probably just saw a deer or something." Mia shook her head violently. No, it stood up. It was on all fours, but it stood up like a man. But its legs, they were all wrong. Backward like—" She stopped, shuddering, unable to finish. We laughed it off at first, thinking she was spooked, but as night fell, the mood shifted. The quiet returned, deeper this time, more oppressive. We all felt it. And then the noises started. At first it was a distant rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. Then came the footsteps, slow and deliberate, just like the night before. But this time, they weren't circling the tents. They were coming toward us, and we huddled around the fire, our flashlights scanning the tree line. And then we saw it. A figure, just barely visible between the trees, crouched low to the ground. It moved with an unnatural grace, too fast, too fluid. And then, just as Mia had said, it stood up. Its legs bent wrong, like a human body forced into an animal's form. The head was elongated like a snout, but the eyes, God, the eyes, they were human, too human. Sam swore under his breath, stumbling backward. "What the hell is that?" We backed away slowly, but the thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching us, its eyes glinting in the firelight. Then, without warning, it dropped back onto all fours and slunk into the shadows, vanishing into the forest. We didn't sleep that night. No one spoke. We just sat there waiting, listening to the sounds of the forest that never came. By morning, we were ready to leave, but as we packed up camp, we noticed something that made my blood run cold. Around our camp, in the dirt, were footprints. Huge, clawed prints, far too large to belong to any animal. They were everywhere, circling us like a predator stalking its prey. The hike back was hell. Every step felt like we were being watched, like that thing was just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. Mia kept muttering under her breath, eyes darting around like she was trying to see it before it saw her. We reached the car just before dusk, but as we loaded our gear into the trunk, I saw something that made me stop cold. On the edge of the parking lot just beyond the trees was the figure again. It stood there watching us, motionless. Then slowly it raised a hand, no, not a hand, but a twisted claw, and pointed directly at me. We sped out of there as fast as we could, but even now, back in the safety of my apartment, I can still feel it watching. I see it sometimes in the corners of my vision, just beyond the edge of the light, waiting, because it knows where I am. I had always thought of camping as a retreat, a way to escape the noise of the city and reconnect with nature. I wasn't prepared for the darkness that lurked just beyond the tree line, nor the horrors that awaited me in the depths of the Blackthorn woods. It was late September when I decided to take a solo trip into the woods. I had heard rumors about the place, stories of strange occurrences and people going missing. But those were just stories, right? I dismissed them as mere embellishments, typical campfire tales. After all, I was an experienced hiker and camper, or so I thought. I arrived at the campsite just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The air was crisp, the forest alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant birds. I set up my tent in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that loomed like sentinels. As I built my fire and prepared dinner, I felt a sense of tranquility wash over me. But as night fell, an unsettling silence enveloped the woods, as if the forest had drawn a breath and held it. The first night was peaceful enough. I roasted marshmallows, listened to the crackling of the fire, and marveled at the stars piercing through the inky sky. But then, around midnight, I heard it. A low, mournful howl that seemed to rise from the very depths of the woods. It sent chills down my spine. Wolves, I thought. Maybe a coyote. I reminded myself that I was in their territory. But the howl came again, this time closer, almost human in its desperation. It echoed through the trees, twisting and rising into a scream that made my blood run cold. I turned off my lantern, plunging myself into darkness, and strained my ears trying to discern the source. Just then my flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into utter blackness. Panic bubbled up inside me as I fumbled for my backup flashlight. The howling continued, growing more frantic. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. Finally, I managed to get the flashlight working again and shone it into the woods. That's when I saw it. A figure stood just at the edge of the tree line, shrouded in darkness. It was tall, impossibly so, and its silhouette seemed to twist unnaturally. I could barely make out its features. Its eyes were glowing, reflecting the beam of my flashlight like two fiery coals. The figure stepped forward, and I caught a glimpse of its face, a grotesque mask of shadows and bone, with a mouth that stretched too wide, revealing teeth like jagged knives. I stumbled back, heart racing, the beam of light shaking as I pointed it at the creature. It let out a sound, a combination of a growl and a wheeze, like it was struggling to breathe. I felt the weight of dread press down on me, urging me to flee. But I was frozen in place, caught in its gaze. With a sudden movement, it lunged forward, and that snapped me out of my trance. I grabbed my gear and took off, crashing through the underbrush, barely able to see where I was going. The howls echoed behind me, more frantic now, a cacophony of voices merging into a single chilling sound. I ran until I couldn't breathe, pushing my body through the thick branches and foliage, desperate to escape. The darkness felt alive, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I was certain it was right behind me, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing but the dense shadows of the forest. Finally, I stumbled upon a small clearing with a dilapidated cabin, its windows dark and broken. I hesitated, but I could hear the creature's howls closing in, and instinct took over. I flung open the door and slammed it shut behind me, locking it tight. Inside, the cabin was empty and decaying, with dust-covered furniture and a musty smell that filled the air. I crept through the rooms, heart pounding, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. The howling outside became frantic, slamming against the cabin like a physical force rattling the walls. Just then, I noticed something on the wall, newspaper clippings, faded and yellowed with age. I stepped closer, squinting to read the headlines. Local man disappears near Blackthorn Woods. Unexplained howls haunt campers. Mysterious figure seen in woods. A chill raced down my spine. These weren't just old stories, they were warnings. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized that the creature outside had claimed its victims, and I was now part of its twisted narrative. I backed away from the wall, heart racing, and turned just as the door rattled violently. Something was trying to get in. I grabbed a rusted piece of metal from the floor and prepared to defend myself. The howling reached a deafening pitch, shaking the very foundation of the cabin. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. A silence fell over the woods, thick and oppressive. I waited, breathless, every muscle tensed. I peered out the broken window, trying to catch a glimpse of the creature. The moonlight illuminated the clearing, and for a brief moment I saw it standing at the edge of the trees, its eyes glowing brighter than before. It didn't move, just watched me. I don't know how long I stood there staring back at that thing. The air felt charged with tension, a standoff between predator and prey. And then, without warning, it turned and melted into the shadows, disappearing as if it had never been there. I waited, heart pounding, for what felt like hours, but the silence remained. Finally, I gathered the courage to leave the cabin. I had to get out of those woods. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, scanning the tree line for any sign of the creature. It was gone, but I knew it wasn't finished with me. I stumbled back to my campsite, adrenaline coursing through me. The tent was still standing, untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I hastily packed my things, keeping my eyes on the dark trees around me, ready for anything. As I made my way back to the trailhead, I kept hearing whispers in the wind, calling my name, taunting me. I wanted to scream, to run faster, but I knew that the woods were not done with me yet. I could feel the weight of the creature's gaze lingering on my back, a constant reminder of the terror I had just faced. When I finally reached my truck, I flung my gear in and sped off, not looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, heart racing and hands shaking. The woods faded behind me, but the whispers didn't stop. I never returned to Blackthorn Woods, but sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still hear that haunting howl echoing in my mind. I can still feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting for the day when I might step back into its territory. And I wonder, what would it take for it to finally claim me? The air in the woods felt heavy, almost thick, as I followed the narrow path deeper into the forest. It was supposed to be a relaxing camping trip. Just me, some quiet time, and nature. No distractions, no work, no stress. That's what I needed. It had been months since I'd taken a break, and this patch of wilderness, far from the busy roads and buzzing phones, seemed perfect. The trees were dense, their branches overhead knitting together to block out most of the daylight. Even though it was only mid-afternoon, the forest had a twilight feel, a dimness that set my nerves on edge, though I couldn't explain why. I told myself it was just the solitude, the unfamiliar sounds of nature making my imagination run wild. But something about the way the light didn't reach the forest floor, how the shadows seemed to shift and stretch, kept me glancing over my shoulder. I reached my chosen campsite, a small clearing nestled between towering pines, their bark mottled with lichen. It was eerily quiet. No wind rustling the leaves, no birds calling to each other, not even the distant hum of insects. Just silence. It felt wrong, but I brushed it off. I was just jumpy. After setting up my tent and getting a small fire going, I sat back, trying to enjoy the peace. But that feeling lingered. You know that sensation? When you're being watched. My skin prickled. I scanned the surrounding trees, half expecting to see someone standing there, hidden in the shadows. Nothing. I shook my head. Get a grip, I muttered to myself, poking at the fire to keep my hands busy. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck refused to settle. The first sign that something was off came when the sun dipped below the horizon. It was fast, too fast. One moment, the sky was a dull gray, and the next, it was as if someone had switched off the lights. Darkness pressed in around me, thicker than it should have been. My fire, small and crackling, seemed like the only point of warmth in an endless void. And then the noises started. At first they were distant, low, guttural sounds, almost like animals, but not quite. They came from deep within the forest, far beyond the reach of my firelight. I tried to tell myself it was just wildlife, but each sound was wrong, somehow distorted, like it was trying to imitate something it didn't quite understand. A snapping twig, a rustle of leaves. Something was moving out there, just beyond where I could see. My pulse quickened. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and pointed it into the trees. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, illuminating only thick trunks and tangled undergrowth. But the noises stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the sounds. I stood there, flashlight shaking in my hand, straining my ears for any sign of movement. Minutes passed. My breath sounded too loud in the quiet. Maybe it was just some animal, curious about the fire. Or maybe it was nothing at all. And then I saw it. A figure, just at the edge of the light's reach, partially obscured by the trees. "Hey," I called out, more to reassure myself than anything. "Who's there?" The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. I pointed the flashlight toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. But as soon as the beam touched where it had been, nothing. No one was there. A cold sweat broke out along my spine. I stood frozen, staring at the spot for what felt like an eternity. The fire crackled behind me, but the rest of the world was unnaturally still. Then came the smell. It hit me like a wave, sickly sweet, like rot mixed with something metallic. My stomach churned. It was so strong that I could taste it in the back of my throat. I stumbled back toward the fire, desperate for the warmth and light. My eyes darted to the trees, scanning for movement, but I saw nothing. Yet, the smell grew stronger. I wasn't alone out here. That much was clear now. I grabbed the hatchet from my gear and held it tight, my knuckles white. Every instinct in my body screamed to leave, to get out of these woods. But leaving meant heading into that blackness, into whatever was out there watching me. Another snap echoed from the forest, closer this time. I swung the flashlight toward the sound and saw something. Not a person, not an animal. It was hunched, its body twisted and wrong, with long, thin limbs that didn't seem to belong to it. Its skin was pale, almost gray, stretched too tight over its bones, and its eyes were glowing. I blinked, convinced I was imagining it. But it moved. Fast. Too fast. The thing darted between the trees, a blur of sickly flesh, before disappearing into the dark. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my pack, my heart racing. My mind scrambled for explanations, but none of them made sense. What the hell had I just seen? My legs felt weak, like they might give out, but I forced myself to stay on my feet. Suddenly there was a sound, a voice, low and garbled, coming from deep in the woods. "Help me!" It was faint, almost like it had been carried on the wind. But it was unmistakable, and it wasn't far away. "Hello?" I called out, though my voice trembled. "Who's out there?" "Help. Me." The voice came again, closer now, clearer. But there was something wrong with it, something deeply wrong. The tone was off, the cadence unnatural, as if whoever was speaking didn't fully understand how to use their voice. I shined the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but the light only revealed more trees and darkness. The smell of rot grew stronger. And then, from the edge of the clearing, I saw it again, the figure. But this time it was standing upright, its limbs impossibly long, its head cocked to one side like a curious animal. It took a step closer, and in the flickering light of the fire I saw its face. No, not a face. It was wearing a face. My face. The skin was stretched across its skull like a mask, too tight, too perfect. Its mouth twitched, trying to form words. Help. Me. But the voice wasn't mine. It lunged. Everything went black. When I woke, the fire was out. The woods were silent. I was alone. And all I could smell was rot. I've always been an outdoorsman. Growing up in rural Oregon, the forest was like a second home to me. I knew the woods, every trail, every animal, every sound. That's why when my buddy Jake suggested a weekend camping trip deep in the Cascades, I didn't hesitate. A few days away from civilization, that sounded perfect. It was late fall, just before the first heavy snowfall. We found a spot far from any known trails, deep in a section of the forest neither of us had explored before. It was wild, untouched, and eerily beautiful. The kind of place you can't find on a map. A place where it felt like time itself stood still. The first day was great. We hiked, set up camp, and spent the afternoon fishing by a crystal-clear stream. As the sun began to set, we built a fire and settled in for the night. The temperature dropped quickly once darkness fell, but we had enough wood to keep the fire roaring. Around 10 p.m., as we sat around the fire talking, we started hearing strange noises in the distance. At first it was faint. Just a rustle here, a crack there. Typical forest sounds, I thought. But then it grew louder, more deliberate. Probably just some elk, Jake said, poking the fire with a stick. But I noticed the look on his face. He didn't really believe that. The noises were coming from all around us now, circling, almost like something was pacing just beyond the tree line. We both grabbed our flashlights and scanned the trees, but the beams barely penetrated the thick darkness. Whatever it is, it's big, I muttered, straining my ears to listen. But the sound stopped as soon as I spoke. For a few minutes there was nothing but silence, not even the wind, just the crackling of the fire and the pounding of my heart in my ears. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, we heard it. A whistle. Long, low, piercing through the still night air like a blade. Jake looked at me wide-eyed. Did you hear that? Yeah, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the crackling fire. The whistle came again, this time closer. It didn't sound like a person, though. It was too strange, too off. It was like someone mimicking a human whistle but getting it wrong. The rhythm was all wrong, too long and slow, like whatever was out there was toying with us. We sat frozen, waiting for something to happen, for something to come out of the trees. But nothing did. After what felt like an eternity, the noises stopped, and the forest returned to its eerie quiet. Let's just get some sleep, I said, though I didn't really believe I'd be able to. I crawled into my tent, keeping my flashlight and knife close. Jake did the same, and soon we both lay there in the suffocating silence, waiting. I don't know how long I lay awake, listening to every little sound, but eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint shadows across the clearing. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper just outside my tent. It was so quiet I thought I might be imagining it, but then I heard it again. A voice, low, raspy, my name. Ian. I froze. My blood ran cold. Ian, come outside. It wasn't Jake's voice. It was something else. Something wrong. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, listening. The voice came again, soft but insistent, calling me, coaxing me. Ian. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly, my hand shaking. The voice was right outside the tent now, so close I could hear the leaves crunching underfoot. Ian. My heart was hammering in my chest. I glanced toward Jake's tent. He had to be hearing this too, right? But his tent was zipped tight. No sign of movement inside. I steeled myself and called out, Jake, are you hearing this? No response. Ian, the voice called again, so close now that I could almost feel its breath on the thin fabric of the tent. I couldn't take it anymore. My instinct screamed at me to run, to leave everything behind and get the hell out of there. But then, as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. The night was deathly quiet again. Too quiet. That's when I noticed something. There were shapes outside my tent. Figures standing just beyond the firelight. I couldn't see them clearly, but they were tall, unnaturally thin, and unmoving. My throat tightened with fear, and I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek through. What I saw made my stomach drop. They were people, or at least they looked like people. But their proportions were all wrong. Limbs too long, heads slightly too large, with skin that seemed to sag unnaturally. They stood in a half circle around the campsite, motionless, watching. Their eyes were hollow, dark, empty. My breath caught in my throat, and I zipped the tent back up, my hands shaking violently. I fumbled for my flashlight, my mind racing. These things, they weren't human. "Ian, come outside." The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't just one voice. There were multiple, all calling my name in unison, in that same raspy, wrong tone. They were trying to draw me out, but I knew that if I went outside, I wouldn't be coming back. I had no idea what to do. Running didn't seem like an option. They were all around us, and they hadn't moved an inch. I could only pray that they wouldn't come inside the tent. Minutes passed like hours, and the whispers eventually stopped. The forest remained unnaturally still, the only sound my own ragged breathing. Somehow, I managed to stay awake until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip my tent and step outside, the clearing was empty. The figures were gone, leaving no sign they'd ever been there. The ground, which had been littered with dry leaves and branches, looked undisturbed. "Jake?" I called, my voice hoarse. No response. I rushed to his tent, unzipped it, and found it empty. His sleeping bag, his gear, everything was still there, but Jake was gone. I searched the entire area, calling his name, but there was no trace of him. It was like he had vanished into thin air. I packed up as quickly as I could and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the car hours later. I called the authorities, but they never found Jake. No footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing. It was as if he'd simply been erased from existence. I still don't know what those things were or what they wanted. But I do know one thing. They're still out there, waiting, watching, and they know your name. I was never one for camping, but when my friends Ben, Jess, and Mark pitched the idea of a weekend in the woods, I couldn't say no. Maybe it was the way they made it sound so idyllic. No cell service, no work, just the four of us and nature. I figured I could handle a couple of days away from civilization. Just 2 nights, and then we'd be back in the real world. We should have stayed there. We drove out to a spot Ben had found online, some forgotten patch of wilderness a few hours out of town. No marked trails, no campsites, just pure isolation. It was exactly what they wanted. "An adventure," Ben had said, grinning as we pulled up to a dirt clearing that passed as a parking lot. We unloaded the gear and set off into the trees, leaving behind the only semblance of humanity. The deeper we hiked, the quieter it got. The sounds of birds, the rustle of leaves, all of it seemed to fade away until all I could hear was the crunch of our boots and my own breathing. I tried to shake the feeling of unease creeping up my spine, but it lingered like a shadow, growing heavier with each step. We set up camp near a small creek just before dusk, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. The place was beautiful in that haunting, untouched way that some forests have. But as the sun started to sink below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows through the trees, I couldn't help but feel like we were intruding. The first night went fine, at least until we all settled down around the fire. Jess was telling some stupid story about a haunted cabin or something, one of those urban legends you tell to spook your friends. But as the story went on, the fire crackled and popped, throwing weird shadows against the trees, and that's when I heard it. A low, distant hum. At first I thought it was just the wind, but it didn't sound like wind. It sounded off. "Do you hear that?" I interrupted, looking toward the darkness. Hear what? Mark asked, poking at the fire with a stick. That humming, I said, straining to listen. It was faint, but steady, like a distant engine. But there was no one out here. No roads, no cabins, nothing. The others stopped talking, and for a second, we all sat there in silence. Jess shook her head. You're hearing things, man. Probably just the creek, Ben added, though his voice wavered just enough to tell me he wasn't sure. I let it go, but that unease, the sense that something wasn't right, it stuck with me. The humming eventually faded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't gone away. Not really. We turned in for the night, each retreating to our tents. The fire burned low, casting a weak glow across the camp as I zipped myself into my sleeping bag. I tried to focus on the familiar sounds, the rustle of leaves, the gurgle of the creek, the occasional hoot of an owl. But underneath it all, I could still hear that low hum, like it was just beneath the surface of reality. I must have fallen asleep at some point because when I woke up, the fire was out, and the night was unnervingly silent. And then there was the sound, a twig snapping, close. My heart pounded as I listened, frozen in place. Another snap, then a soft rustling, like something, or someone, was moving just outside the tent. I held my breath, ears straining to pick up every little noise. There it was again, a faint shuffling circling the camp. I reached over and shook Mark's shoulder. He groaned, half asleep. Mark, wake up, I whispered. There's something outside. He opened one bleary eye and listened. It's probably a raccoon or something. Go back to sleep. But it didn't sound like a raccoon. It sounded bigger, heavier. Before I could say anything else, there was a low growl, deep, guttural, and far too close for comfort. Mark shot up, now fully awake, his eyes wide with fear. Did you hear that? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Yeah, he whispered back, grabbing the flashlight from his bag. Stay quiet. We both sat there, hearts racing, listening to the soft crunch of leaves. Then, with trembling hands, Mark unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. He flicked on the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the campsite. At first, there was nothing, just trees and darkness. But then, at the edge of the light, I saw it. A figure. Tall, pale, and hunched over, like it was too large for its own body. It was standing just beyond the tree line, watching us. Jesus Christ, Mark breathed, and I knew he saw it too. We sat frozen, staring at the thing. It didn't move. It just stood there, silent, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Then, slowly, it took a step forward, coming into the light. My stomach dropped. It looked human, but something was horribly wrong. Its limbs were too long, its skin too smooth, and its eyes, oh God, its eyes, were black and empty, like it was something wearing a human body, but didn't know how. Mark yanked the tent shut, his face pale. We need to get out of here. We grabbed our gear, trying to stay quiet, but every sound we made felt deafening in the stillness. I could feel the thing watching us, feel its gaze burning into the back of my neck. The others hadn't woken up yet, but as soon as we unzipped the tent, Ben and Jess stirred. We told them what we saw, but they didn't believe us at first. They thought it was some kind of prank. That is, until we heard the footsteps again, slow, deliberate, coming closer. Ben's face went pale, and without a word, we all grabbed what we could and started running. We didn't care about the trail, didn't care about where we were going. We just needed to get away. The woods were pitch black, the trees closing in on us like they were alive. Branches clawed at our arms and legs, but we didn't stop. The humming was back, louder this time, vibrating in my skull. It felt like it was coming from all around us, like the forest itself was alive with it. We ran for what felt like hours, our breaths ragged, hearts pounding, until we finally broke through the trees and stumbled back to the car. We threw ourselves inside, and Ben floored it, the tires spinning in the dirt before catching hold. We didn't stop driving until we hit the nearest town. None of us have talked about it since, but every now and then, when I'm lying in bed late at night, I hear it again. That low, insistent hum, just on the edge of hearing, and I know it's still out there, waiting. I never should have gone camping alone. It had been a long time since I'd felt the need to disconnect, but the pressure of city life was gnawing at me, and I thought a weekend in the woods would do the trick. So, I packed light and drove north to a stretch of wilderness known as Wolf Hollow. It was remote, barely marked on any maps, and that was exactly what I needed. The moment I stepped out of the car, I felt it. The air in Wolf Hollow was wrong. Heavy, too still, like even the wind didn't dare pass through the trees. I shrugged off the unease, telling myself it was just the unfamiliar solitude. The first red flag came when I stopped by the ranger station to check in. The ranger was a tall, gaunt man with eyes that seemed too small for his face. He didn't smile, didn't welcome me. He just stared, lips slightly parted, like he was waiting for me to say something that would disappoint him. When I told him I was heading into the hollow, he looked out the window, frowning. Wolf Hollow ain't the place for solo camping, friend. Things happen out there. He didn't elaborate, just handed me a crumpled map, shaking his head. As I left, I caught sight of another ranger, older, grizzled, with a strange limp, watching me from behind a tree. His gaze felt like a weight on my back as I walked to my car. I tried not to think about it. The first day passed without incident. I set up camp in a clearing, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to press in from all sides. The canopy was so dense that the sun barely reached the forest floor, casting long, ominous shadows even in broad daylight. As night fell, the woods came alive with sounds, rustling leaves, distant calls of animals, the occasional crack of a branch. But around midnight, the noises stopped. Completely. No wind, no animals, just silence. I lay in my tent, eyes wide open, straining to hear anything. Then came a sound that cut through the quiet, a low, guttural growl. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It was closer, deeper, more deliberate. I felt my skin prickle with fear. The growl echoed once, twice, and then nothing. I lay there, heart hammering in my chest, until exhaustion finally took over. The next morning I found deep claw marks on a tree about 30 feet from my tent, long, jagged gouges that dug into the bark like something had been sharpening its claws. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I convinced myself it was just a bear or some other animal. The second night was worse, much worse. I had barely drifted off to sleep when I heard voices. At first I thought it was other campers, maybe passing nearby, but as I listened, my stomach twisted. The voices were strange, too soft, too distorted, like someone was trying to mimic human speech but didn't quite know how. They whispered just beyond the light of my campfire, circling the clearing. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, mocking. Then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate thuds, pacing just beyond my line of sight. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it into the trees. Nothing. But I knew. Something was there, watching. That's when I heard the laughter. High-pitched, breathy giggles like a child's, but warped, stretched into something unnatural. It came from every direction at once, as if the forest itself was laughing at me. My pulse quickened. I grabbed the map, the one the ranger had given me, thinking I could leave before dawn, but something on the map had changed. The trail I had taken to get here was gone. In its place was a jagged, twisting line that led deeper into the forest, ending at a mark I hadn't noticed before, an X, right in the heart of Wolf Hollow. I didn't sleep after that. At first light I packed up and started back toward where I thought my car was. But no matter how far I walked, the trees seemed to stretch on forever. The path twisted in ways I didn't recognize, leading me in circles. Hours passed, but there was no sign of the trailhead. No sound of the nearby river I had crossed on the way in. Just more trees and more silence. It wasn't until late afternoon that I stumbled upon something strange. A campsite, abandoned, the fire long dead. There were 3 tents and gear strewn about as if whoever had been there left in a hurry. But no people and no tracks. That's when I found the journal. It belonged to another camper, someone who had come to Wolf Hollow a few weeks before. The entries were frantic, desperate. Warnings about creatures in the woods, about something stalking them from the shadows. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. They're not animals. They're wearing their skins. They mimic voices. Don't trust the rangers. I dropped the journal and backed away from the campsite, my heart racing. The sun was setting and the woods were growing darker by the second. I had to get out. But as I turned to leave, I saw something moving in the distance. At first it looked like a deer, but it was too tall, standing on 2 legs. Its skin was stretched tight over its body, the limbs unnaturally long, the joints bending the wrong way. It stared at me with hollow black eyes, and then it smiled, a grotesque skin-splitting grin. I ran. Branches whipped at my face, my lungs burning as I sprinted through the undergrowth. But no matter how fast I ran, I could hear them behind me. The footsteps, the laughter, closer and closer. I tripped, falling hard onto the ground, and as I looked up, I saw them. The rangers. They stood in a circle around me, but their faces weren't right. Their skin sagged, their eyes were too small, and their mouths hung open in unnatural, permanent grins. Behind them, the creatures, those things wearing animal skins, lurked, half hidden in the trees, watching with hungry eyes. The older ranger stepped forward, his grin widening. "You were always part of this place," he rasped. "The forest remembers." And then I understood. I had been drawn here, not by the need to escape the city, but by something much older. Something deep within these woods had called me back. The forest, the creatures, the rangers. They were all part of it, part of me. This was no camping trip. It was a return to where I belonged. And as the creatures closed in, their whispers growing louder, I knew there was no leaving Wolf Hollow. Not ever. I was home. I always loved camping. There's something about the solitude of the woods, the crackling of a fire, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. It made me feel alive. I used to go every year with my friends, a tradition we started back in college. But after last year, I don't think I'll ever set foot in the forest again. It started like any other trip. We drove out to our usual spot deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a place called Bear Ridge, far off the beaten path, and secluded enough that you could go days without seeing another soul. It was me, Jake, Sarah, and Chris. The 4 of us had been doing this for years, so we knew the drill: pitch the tents, gather firewood, and crack open a few beers while we watched the sun set. That first night was perfect. The air was cool but not too cold, the sky was clear, and the firelight flickered warmly against the trees. We told stories, laughed about old times, and made plans for a hike the next morning. There was something special about being out there with no cell service, no distractions, just us and the wilderness. But the next day everything started to change. We woke up early and packed our gear for the hike. There was a trail that led to a hidden waterfall a few miles from camp, one we'd been meaning to check out for years. The trail itself was rough, overgrown in some parts, and the further we went, the more it seemed like no one had been through there in a long time. The forest felt thicker, darker, almost suffocating. I chalked it up to the remoteness of the area, but Sarah kept glancing over her shoulder like she could feel something watching us. About halfway there, Chris spotted something strange. Off to the side of the trail, hidden among the trees, was what looked like an old wooden sign, weathered and half-rotted. The words were barely legible, but we could make out part of it. "Do not enter." Jake laughed it off, saying it was probably just a joke or some forgotten warning from when the trail was more popular. But something about it bothered me. The way the wood was cracked and splintered, like it had been there far longer than it should have, and the forest beyond the sign, well, it felt different, quieter, like the trees were holding their breath. Against my better judgment, we kept going. It wasn't long after that we found the clearing. The map had said the waterfall would be just beyond it, but instead of water, we found something else. The first thing we noticed was the smell. It was faint at first, but as we stepped into the clearing, it hit us like a wall. Rotting, decaying, and earthy, like something had been left to die out in the open. In the center of the clearing there was a pile of rocks, stacked into a strange, unnatural shape. It looked like some kind of marker, but what it was marking, I didn't want to know. Chris walked over to it, curious as always, and kicked one of the rocks. That's when we saw what was underneath. Bones. Human bones. They were old, yellowed, and brittle, but unmistakable. I remember Sarah gasping, her hand flying to her mouth. Jake tried to rationalize it, saying it was probably some kind of historical burial site, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe it. We should have left then. We should have turned around and gone back to camp. But instead, we just stood there, frozen, as if the forest had trapped us in place. That's when we heard the whispering. At first it was so faint I thought it was the wind, but it grew louder, coming from all around us, though there was no one there. The voices were soft, like they were just out of reach, speaking words I couldn't understand. They seemed to echo off the trees, circling us, closing in. And then I saw it. Movement at the edge of the clearing. There was something in the woods just beyond the tree line. At first it was just a shadow, barely visible through the underbrush. But as it moved closer, I saw more. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow the light. I couldn't move. None of us could. We just stood there, staring at this thing as it moved closer, its movements slow and deliberate. The whispering grew louder, almost frantic, like 100 voices all speaking at once. And then it smiled. Not a normal smile, but something twisted, as if it wasn't sure how human expressions were supposed to work. That's when Jake screamed. He turned and bolted back the way we came, and that seemed to snap the rest of us out of our trance. We ran after him, crashing through the trees, not caring about the trail or where we were going. We just needed to get away from that thing. I could hear it behind us, its footsteps soft but unnaturally fast, like it was gliding through the forest. The whispers followed us, rising in pitch, almost like laughter. When we finally burst out of the woods and into our campsite, Jake was nowhere to be found. The fire had gone out, and everything felt wrong, like the forest had shifted somehow. We called his name over and over, but there was no answer. Sarah was in tears. Chris was swearing under his breath, and I felt like I was in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. We searched for hours, but Jake was gone. There was no trace of him, not even footprints leading away from the camp. It was like he had just vanished into thin air. Eventually, we decided to head back to the car and get help. But when we reached the spot where we had parked, there was nothing. No car, no road. Just more trees, stretching out in every direction. I don't know how long we wandered after that. The sun never seemed to rise, and the forest never seemed to end. The whispering never stopped, and every so often I'd catch a glimpse of that thing, watching us from the shadows, always just out of reach. And we were trapped, lost in a forest that shouldn't exist, being hunted by something that wasn't human. In the end, I don't know how I got out. I remember collapsing by a tree, exhausted and terrified, the whispers growing louder, closer, and then nothing. I woke up in the ranger station, miles from where we'd been, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. The rangers told me I'd been missing for 3 days. They never found Jake. Sarah and Chris don't talk about it anymore. I've tried to forget, to convince myself that it was all some kind of shared hallucination, but sometimes late at night I still hear the whispering. And I know, deep down, that it's waiting for me to come back. But I never will. I always loved camping alone, the solitude, the quiet. It gave me time to think, to breathe. No distractions, just me, the trees, and the sky. This time I decided to go deeper into the woods than ever before. I found an old trail, overgrown and unused, and followed it for miles until it disappeared entirely. The place I found was perfect, untouched by anyone for what looked like years. The sun was setting when I set up camp. It draped everything in gold and shadow, the trees casting long fingers across the ground. The air was still, but the kind of stillness that felt aware, like the woods were holding their breath. I shrugged off the feeling and got my fire going, trying to shake off the gnawing tension creeping up my spine. As the night settled in, the usual forest noises started up, the rustling of leaves, the chirp of crickets. But it was quieter than I expected. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world around you is listening. My fire was small, just enough to cook some food and keep the night at bay, but it seemed to flicker weaker than it should have. Then I heard it, a distant sound, faint but distinct, like a branch snapping underfoot. I froze, listening hard, but there was nothing more. I glanced toward the trees, my eyes scanning the dark gaps between them. Probably just a deer. That's what I told myself. But it didn't feel like that. I sat back down, forcing myself to focus on the fire, on the crackling logs, and the warmth against the chill of the evening air. The wind had picked up slightly, whispering through the branches above, making them creak like old bones. An hour passed, maybe more. The unease still gnawed at me, but I wasn't about to let my imagination get the best of me. I leaned back against a log and looked up at the stars, trying to let the vastness of the sky swallow my anxiety. That's when I heard it again, a sound closer this time. It wasn't the snap of a branch, it was a voice, faint, carried on the wind. I straightened up, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained to listen, but the voice had stopped. Maybe I imagined it. Out here, in the dark, it's easy for your mind to play tricks on you. And then it came again, louder, clearer. Someone was calling my name, and I felt ice crawl up my spine. My name, out here, deep in the woods, miles away from anyone. It was impossible, but I knew what I'd heard. The voice was soft, pleading, like someone was lost. Someone who knew me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it over the trees. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, illuminating only trunks and shadows. My fire cast a flickering glow, but beyond that the woods were impenetrable. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. "Who's out there?" For a moment the only sound was the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and then the voice came again, closer, much closer. "Please help me." The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was my voice, and I felt my stomach twist into knots, my blood turning cold. It wasn't just similar. It was exactly my voice, calling out from somewhere deep in the trees. And worse, it sounded off, like a recording played back just a little too slow, a little too distorted. Panic surged through me. I stood up, the flashlight trembling in my hand, shining it into the woods, my heart racing. "Who's out there?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. Nothing. I should have left. I should have packed up my gear right then and there and bolted down the path. But something held me. Some stupid curiosity. Or maybe I was too frozen by fear to move. A branch snapped directly behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam catching something between the trees. It was a figure, standing just at the edge of the light, tall and unmoving. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make out the shape. It was wrong. The figure, it was too tall. Its limbs were long, unnaturally long, hanging limply at its sides, and its face, if you could call it that, was just empty, smooth, like someone had erased its features. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, but the thing didn't move. It just stood there, its head slightly tilted, as if studying me. Then it spoke. "Please, help me." My voice. Again. I blinked, shaking my head. This couldn't be real. I pointed the flashlight directly at it, but the light seemed to waver around the figure, as if it were slipping between the gaps of the trees, never fully illuminated. I took another step back, my breath quick and shallow, my mind racing for an explanation. Maybe it was a trick, some kind of prank, but deep down, I knew better. The thing standing in front of me wasn't human, and whatever it wasn't friendly. The thing moved, not walked, moved. Its body seemed to twitch, jerking forward in an unnatural, almost insect-like way. The smooth face twisted as it leaned closer to the edge of the light, and I swear it began to smile, not with a mouth but with the shifting of skin pulling taut as if it were about to burst. "Help me," it said again, my voice dripping with mockery now, low and slow, like it was savoring the sound. I bolted. I don't remember making the decision to run, but my legs carried me, crashing through the underbrush as fast as they could. The flashlight bounced wildly in my grip, its beam dancing between the trees as I tore through the woods. Behind me, I heard the thing. Its movements were erratic, unnatural, like it didn't quite know how to run but was giving chase anyway. The voice echoed after me, distorted and warping as it mimicked me, calling out over and over, "Help me!" I didn't stop. I didn't look back. My only focus was getting out, getting as far away as possible. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees blurring together, the darkness closing in. Finally, I saw the edge of the woods, the trailhead. I stumbled into it, panting, gasping for breath. My legs ached, my lungs burning as I collapsed against the trunk of a tree. The woods behind me were silent. I stayed there for what felt like hours, staring into the trees, waiting for the thing to emerge. But it didn't. I don't know how I made it out. I don't know what I saw. But I do know this. The voice that had followed me out wasn't mine. It never was. I wasn't supposed to be out there deep in the woods of Pine Creek. My friends and I had come for a weekend escape, camping, fishing, and drinking by the fire. It was a well-known spot, but I'd heard stories. The locals didn't like to talk about Pine Creek after dark, but we didn't care. Young and stupid, we shrugged it off as nothing but folklore. That first day was normal enough. We hiked the trails, set up camp near the creek, and cooked over the fire. My best friend Jake had brought a cheap bottle of whiskey, and we passed it around, the cold night air biting at our skin as the fire crackled. The woods were so thick, the trees so close together, that the campfire felt like the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. It was when the ranger came that things started feeling off. He appeared out of nowhere, stepping silently out of the trees like he'd been watching us. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform neat but old, like it had seen decades of wear. His face was blank, eyes hollow and dark, but his smile, it didn't reach those eyes. "Y'all better be careful out here," he said, his voice too quiet for his size. "Strange things happen in these parts." He stared at me for too long before turning and disappearing back into the trees, not making a sound as he left. We laughed it off, pretending it didn't creep us out, but I noticed the way the others shifted uneasily after he'd gone. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. I figured it was one of my friends taking a midnight leak, but when I glanced out of my tent, no one was there. Only the dying embers of the fire remained, casting a dim glow around the campsite. I lay back down, trying to brush off the unease, but the footsteps returned, closer this time, circling the camp. They were heavy, deliberate, and slow. My heart began to pound as I strained to listen. Then came the voice, low and gravelly, just outside my tent. "Help me." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't one of my friends. The voice sounded wrong, like it was broken, like someone was trying to imitate a human voice but didn't quite know how. "Please, help me." I clenched my fists, too terrified to move. The voice repeated, circling the camp. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. stretching on for what felt like hours. When I finally found the courage to unzip the tent and peek out, nothing was there, but something was wrong. The air was thick, suffocating. The trees looked taller, darker, pressing in on the campsite. The next morning I asked if anyone else had heard the voice. Jake just shook his head, but he looked pale, like he hadn't slept. The others laughed it off, teasing me about ghost stories, but the unease lingered between us. We hiked further into the woods that afternoon, looking for a spot to fish along the creek. The trees were even denser here, branches clawing at the sky. The path was narrow, and the sunlight barely filtered through, but it wasn't until we stumbled upon the cabin that things took a turn for the worse. It was old, rotting, barely standing. The windows were smashed and the door hung off its hinges. The others dared each other to go inside, but I stayed back, something gnawing at my gut. There was a smell in the air, sour, like decaying meat. And then I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the tree line watching us. At first I thought it was the ranger again, but as I squinted I realized it wasn't. It was taller, thinner, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, just stood there watching. I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could, Jake shouted from inside the cabin. I rushed over, heart racing, and found him standing in the doorway, pale as a ghost. He pointed to the floor where a set of claw marks had been scratched deep into the wood, the marks fresh. The others crowded around, but no one said a word. That night back at camp, the mood had changed. We kept the fire burning bright, no one straying too far from the light. Jake wouldn't stop fidgeting, his eyes darting toward the trees like he was expecting something to jump out. He hadn't said much since the cabin, and when he did speak, his voice was shaky, hollow. It was around midnight when we heard it again, the voice. "Help me." It was closer this time, right at the edge of the firelight. We all heard it. There was no denying it now. Jake grabbed his flashlight, shining it into the trees, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. The voice came again, more desperate. "Please help me." Suddenly something moved in the trees just beyond the light, a figure barely visible. We all jumped to our feet, eyes wide. But when Jake pointed his flashlight, the figure was gone. Then, without warning, the fire blew out. Panic set in. The darkness swallowed us whole, and we could hear movement all around. Branches snapping, footsteps crunching in the leaves. Something was out there, circling us. I grabbed my own flashlight, my hands trembling, and shined it wildly around the camp. That's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the camp was the same figure from earlier, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It wasn't human. Its skin was pale, stretched thin over its bones, and its limbs were unnaturally long, fingers ending in sharp black claws. It moved with a jerking, unnatural motion, its head tilting from side to side as it watched us. Jake screamed and ran toward the car, but before he could get far, something large and fast darted out from the trees, tackling him to the ground. He screamed again, but the sound was quickly muffled by the sound of flesh tearing. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The others scattered, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the thing that was now dragging Jake's body into the darkness, its glowing eyes fixed on me. Then, just as quickly as it began, the woods fell silent again. I don't remember how long I stood there staring into the blackness, waiting for something to happen. When I finally gathered the courage to move, I stumbled to the ranger station, gasping for breath. But when I burst through the door, the ranger from before was there, sitting at the desk, waiting, his hollow eyes fixed on me. "They don't like it when you wander too far," he said, a slow grin creeping across his face. "The forest keeps what it wants." I ran. I didn't stop running until I was miles from Pine Creek, my mind racing, heart pounding. I didn't go back for my friends. I couldn't. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear that voice, whispering from the dark, "Help me." I've always loved camping alone, something about the solitude, the quiet, just me and the wild. It was my way of escaping the noise of everyday life. My friends thought I was crazy for going deep into the woods without any company, but I always shrugged it off. I'd done it countless times without a hitch. But that was before that night. I decided to head up to a place I'd never been before, an isolated stretch of forest in the northern Rockies. A friend of a friend had told me about it, said it was perfect if you wanted to be truly alone. No trails, no campers, no nothing. The idea of it thrilled me. I wanted the experience of complete isolation. The hike in was peaceful. The trail disappeared after about 5 miles, and I had to bushwhack the rest of the way. By the time I found a decent clearing to set up camp, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the pines. The clearing was perfect, flat, with just enough space for my tent, and surrounded by trees that made it feel like I was in a cocoon of nature. I set up camp quickly, eager to get a fire going before nightfall. As the flames crackled to life, I sat back, enjoying the quiet. No buzzing phones, no voices, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional snap of a branch. But as night settled in, something felt different, off. It wasn't the normal forest sounds. In fact, it was the lack of sounds that caught my attention. The usual chorus of insects and distant hoots of owls were absent. The forest was dead silent. I told myself it was just because I was deep in a remote area, far from any human activity. It didn't mean anything. I had a fire, my gear, and the sky was clear, the stars shining bright overhead. I should have felt at peace, but instead I felt watched. Brushing it off, I crawled into my tent, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. I must have drifted off for a while because when I woke up, the fire outside had died down to glowing embers. That's when I heard it. A soft, almost rhythmic sound. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon shuffling around outside. But as I lay there, holding my breath, I realized it wasn't footsteps. It was something else. A scraping sound like metal on stone. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. I listened, straining to make sense of it. It was slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of the tree line. I reached for my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, poking my head out. The clearing was still. My dying fire cast a dim glow, just enough to see the immediate area. But the trees beyond? Nothing but blackness. The scraping sound had stopped. I shined my flashlight toward the trees, sweeping it across the clearing. Nothing. No movement, no animals. Just trees and shadows. I told myself it was probably a branch, rubbing against a rock or maybe an old fence post buried in the undergrowth. Nothing to worry about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, lurking just beyond the firelight. Watching. I stoked the fire, hoping the flames would chase away whatever anxiety had gripped me, then went back inside the tent, lying there with my eyes wide open, waiting. Maybe an hour passed before I heard it again. This time the sound was closer, much closer, right at the edge of the clearing, a long, slow scrape, like something dragging across the ground. I sat bolt upright, grabbing my flashlight and shining it through the tent's mesh window. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it might burst from my chest. And then, in the dim glow of the fire, I saw something. A shape, hunched low, moving between the trees. I couldn't make it out clearly, but it was big. Too big to be a deer, too tall to be any kind of animal I'd seen out here. It moved strangely, almost jerking, like it wasn't used to walking on 2 legs. I stayed frozen, barely breathing, watching as it slowly moved along the edge of the clearing, just outside the reach of the firelight. And then it stopped. It stood there facing my tent, and I swear I saw 2 glowing eyes reflecting in the darkness. I thought about grabbing the knife I kept in my pack, but what good would it do? I was miles from anyone, completely alone with whatever was out there. Running wouldn't help. There was no way I could outrun it, not in the dark. I did the only thing I could think of. I doused the fire. In hindsight, I don't know why I did it. Maybe I thought the darkness would make me invisible, that whatever was watching me would lose interest if it couldn't see me. But after the fire went out, the scraping sound returned, closer now, louder. And then I heard breathing. Low, heavy breathing, like something huge was right outside my tent. My hands shook as I gripped the flashlight, terrified to shine it in the direction of the sound. I was too scared to move, too scared to even blink. I just sat there, listening, my whole body rigid with fear. And then, without warning, the tent walls bulged inward like something was pressing against it, pushing in on all sides. I scrambled backward, my mind racing, but there was nowhere to go. It was right there, just on the other side of the thin fabric, pressing in, testing the boundaries. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the pressure stopped. The tent walls returned to normal, and the heavy breathing faded into the night. The silence returned, but now it was even more oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. I don't know how long I stayed like that, frozen, flashlight in hand, listening to the silence. Minutes? Hours? I didn't sleep at all that night. At the first light of dawn, I threw open the tent and packed my things as fast as I could. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before, except for one thing. A deep, jagged groove cut into the earth, circling the tent, like something had dragged its claws through the dirt while I slept. I didn't stick around to inspect it. I just grabbed my gear and started hiking back to the car. Every step felt like I was being watched. I kept my eyes straight ahead, refusing to look back, refusing to acknowledge that something had followed me through the woods the entire time. When I finally reached my car and slammed the door shut, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was still watching me, waiting. I haven't been camping alone since that night, and I never will again. Some places aren't meant to be explored alone. I've always loved camping, the solitude, the escape from the grind of daily life, the quiet that you can only find deep in the woods. For years I'd been taking solo trips into the wild, but nothing prepared me for what happened last fall. I don't talk about it much. People wouldn't believe me if I did. Hell, I'm not even sure I believe it myself. It was early October, the air cool with the first hints of winter creeping in. I'd picked a spot far off the beaten path, about a 2-day hike from the nearest trailhead. A perfect, isolated haven deep in the forest. There was no one for miles, just me, my gear, and the whisper of the trees swaying in the wind. I set up camp by a small lake, the water dark and still, reflecting the dense pine forest that stretched out endlessly in every direction. The first night was peaceful, the kind of quiet where you can hear your own heartbeat. I stayed up late by the fire, watching the embers glow under a blanket of stars, before crawling into my tent for the night. It wasn't until the second day that things started to feel off. It was subtle at first. The usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, insects buzzing, seemed to fade as the day wore on. By mid-afternoon, there was only silence. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant animal calls, just nothing. It was like the woods were holding their breath. I shrugged it off at first. Maybe a storm was coming, I told myself. Animals always go quiet before a storm. But as I gathered firewood that evening, I started to get the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone. You know that sensation you get when someone's watching you, that prickling on the back of your neck? I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone there, but there was nothing. Just trees, dense and dark, their shadows growing longer as the sun sank lower in the sky. Back at camp, I built up the fire and sat close, my unease growing with the darkness. The quiet was oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. I thought about packing up and heading out, but it was too late in the day. It wasn't safe to navigate the woods at night. Then I heard it. A low guttural growl, faint but unmistakable, came from somewhere deep in the forest behind me. I froze, my eyes scanning the tree line, but I couldn't see anything. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows that made the woods look alive, shifting and swaying. I told myself it was just a bear, or maybe a wolf. I'd dealt with animals before, and as long as I stayed by the fire, I'd be safe. But the growling didn't stop. It circled the camp, moving slowly, methodically. Sometimes it would fade, only to start up again from a different direction. Whatever it was stalking me, watching. By now my heart was pounding in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees, sweeping the beam back and forth. Nothing. The woods swallowed the light, revealing only twisted branches and the occasional glint of something far off, something reflective, like eyes. But they were gone before I could focus on them. The growling stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so deep it rang in my ears. I stood there, listening, straining to hear anything, and then I heard a new sound. A voice. My voice. It was distant, echoing through the trees, a perfect mimicry of my own. Help. Please. Help. It called, distorted, like it was being dragged through water. My blood ran cold. I whipped around, scanning the darkness, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it seemed to move, circling the camp like the growl had. Then I saw it. A shape, barely visible at the edge of the firelight. At first it looked like a person standing just within the shadow of the trees. My flashlight flickered over it, catching glimpses of pale skin and long limbs. It stood too still, too straight, like it wasn't used to being on 2 feet. My voice came again from its direction, but now it was louder, closer, like it was coming from right behind me. I turned, heart hammering in my chest, but no one was there. When I turned back to the figure, it had moved closer, just at the edge of the light now. My skin crawled as I realized it wasn't human. Its proportions were all wrong. Its arms too long, its legs bending in ways that shouldn't be possible. It had no eyes, just dark sunken holes where they should have been, and its mouth was a wide slit, grinning with too many teeth. The thing spoke again, this time in a garbled whisper that barely sounded human. Come here. I backed away slowly, my flashlight flickering in my shaking hand. The thing stepped into the light, and I saw it clearly for the first time. Its skin was mottled in gray, stretched tight over bones that jutted out at sharp angles. It had no nose, just slits where its nostrils should be, and its grin widened unnaturally as it crouched low, preparing to pounce. I did the only thing I could think of. I threw the flashlight at it and bolted for my tent. I barely made it inside before I heard the sound of it crashing through the trees after me. My heart pounded in my throat as I grabbed my knife and sat, shaking, waiting for it to tear through the thin fabric. But it didn't. The thing stopped just outside the tent, its breath rasping and wet, like it was trying to mimic the sound of breathing. I could hear it sniffing, shuffling around, circling. My own breath was ragged, loud in the silence, but I stayed still, gripping the knife until my knuckles turned white. Then it spoke again, this time in a perfect copy of my own voice, just inches from the tent. Let me in. I didn't sleep that night. I don't think I even blinked. I just sat there, listening as it circled, over and over, repeating the same phrase in my voice, sometimes laughing quietly to itself, other times growling low in its throat. At some point, it stopped. The sun rose, and the sounds of the forest returned as if nothing had happened. I stepped out of the tent cautiously, knife in hand, but the thing was gone. Only deep, clawed tracks in the dirt circled my camp, evidence that it hadn't been a nightmare. I packed up and left within the hour, not stopping until I was back at my car. I've never gone back to that part of the forest. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm home, I still hear my own voice calling to me from the woods, asking to be let in. I've always loved camping, the peace, the quiet, the crackling of a campfire under a blanket of stars. It's like stepping out of time. I've been doing it since I was a kid, and I thought I'd seen everything the wilderness had to offer. But I was wrong. Last summer I decided to do something different, something off the beaten path. No campgrounds, no marked trails, just pure wilderness. There's this spot about 50 miles deep into a national forest that I'd heard about from a fellow outdoorsman. He warned me it was remote and not often traveled. But that's exactly what I wanted. No people, no noise, just me in the wild. The first day was uneventful. I hiked through some thick forest, the air rich with the smell of pine and earth. I set up camp by a small stream, fished a little, cooked some trout over the fire, and watched the stars blink into view. It was perfect. But that night something felt off. It started with the sounds. When you're deep in the woods, you get used to certain noises, wind in the trees, nocturnal animals rustling through the underbrush, the distant calls of owls. But this was different. It was subtle at first, almost like a faint hum, but as the night went on, it grew louder. I couldn't place it, just this low, droning sound like something big was moving through the forest, but too far away for me to make out clearly. I tried to brush it off, told myself it was just the wind or my mind playing tricks on me. But the longer I listened, the more it sounded unnatural. It wasn't rhythmic like the wind. It was random, stuttering almost, like something struggling to breathe. I should have packed up right then and there, but I didn't. I just stoked the fire a little higher and forced myself to go to sleep. The next day I woke up feeling groggy, like I hadn't slept at all. The air felt heavier somehow, like a storm was coming, but the sky was clear. I packed up and moved deeper into the forest, pushing toward the area I'd heard about, the untouched part where no one ever goes. The farther I hiked, the more isolated I felt. By midday, even the birds had stopped chirping. The forest around me seemed dead. No wind, no movement, just trees standing still like towering sentinels. That strange hum from the night before had returned, faint but ever present, like it was following me. By late afternoon, I found a clearing, a perfect spot to set up camp again. As I unpacked, I noticed something strange. There were markings on some of the trees, deep gouges that didn't look like anything made by an animal. Long, jagged scratches, almost like symbols carved high up into the bark, too high for any normal creature to reach. I ran my hand over one of the marks, and it was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been in the middle of summer. I tried to shake off the unease and focused on building my fire. As night fell, the hum grew louder again. This time, it wasn't just a background noise. It felt like it was closing in on me. And then the whispers started. At first I thought it was the wind slipping through the trees, but there was no wind. The air was dead still. The whispers were faint, just beyond my hearing, like voices carried from a distance, too far to understand but close enough to send a chill down my spine. I'm not someone who scares easily. I've camped in some pretty remote places, and I know the tricks the wilderness can play on your mind. But this was different. This wasn't my mind playing tricks. Something was out there. I sat by the fire, staring into the dark, flashlight in hand, listening. The whispers grew louder, and now I could pick out words. My name. I swear to God it was my name. Jacob. It came from the tree line, from deep within the woods. My heart started racing. No one knew I was out here. There wasn't another soul for miles. I stood up, scanning the trees with my light, but the beam only pierced the first few feet of the dense woods. Jacob. The voice came again, closer this time. I could feel something watching me from the shadows. Every instinct in my body screamed to get the hell out of there, but I was frozen in place, gripping the flashlight like it could somehow protect me. Then I saw it, just a glimpse at first, something tall, too tall to be human, moving between the trees. Its shape was wrong, elongated and twisted, like its limbs were stretched too far. It moved with a jerking, unnatural gait, almost like it didn't know how to walk properly. Jacob! The voice was right behind me now, and I whipped around, expecting to see someone or something, but there was nothing. Just the fire, crackling softly, the only normal sound in an otherwise dead forest. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up what I could, leaving half my gear behind, and started hiking back the way I came. The whispers followed me, circling around, taunting me with my own name. And that hum. It was all around me now, vibrating in my bones, getting louder, closer. As I pushed through the trees, the whispers changed. They stopped saying my name and started imitating me. I heard my own voice echoing back at me from the darkness. It was warped, distorted, but it was me, calling out, begging for help. "Help me, Jacob." I broke into a run, adrenaline flooding my veins. I didn't care about direction anymore. I just needed to get out. But no matter how far I went, how fast I moved, the whispers stayed with me. And worse, that thing, whatever it was, it followed. At one point I glanced back, and there it was, just at the edge of my vision, tall and gaunt, limbs too long for its body, pale skin stretched tight over bone, its head twisted unnaturally, following me as I ran. And its face, God, its face was a blank, empty slate. No features, just smooth, pale flesh. I don't remember much after that. I must have run all night, because the next thing I knew, I was stumbling out of the woods, back onto the main road, drenched in sweat and covered in scratches from the branches I'd pushed through. A search team found me the next day, wandering in a daze miles from where I should have been. I never went back to get the gear I left behind. I never camped again after that. And the worst part? Sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear it. That hum, faint and distant, but growing closer. And I know deep down, it's still out there. It's still waiting. I didn't believe the stories at first. You hear things when you grow up in a small town. Legends about the woods, warnings passed down from old folks who seem to enjoy scaring kids more than anything else. But after what happened last night, I'm not laughing anymore. I'm a camper. Well, more like a hobbyist. I've spent most weekends out in the wilderness, alone with my tent, my gear, and the solitude. It's peaceful. A way to clear my head after a long week in the city. The town I live near, Maple Hollow, is quiet and out of the way, and there are some great trails around here. The kind that make you forget the world exists. But there's one area no one goes near, Black Pines. The forest stretches for miles, dense and dark, the kind of place that swallows the light by mid-afternoon. No marked trails, no campers, no hikers. The locals call it cursed. They talk about creatures, strange figures that mimic people, sounds that draw you deeper until you're too lost to find your way back. I always thought it was nonsense, until now. It started when I got the bright idea to camp there, just for the weekend, a challenge. I was sick of the usual spots, bored of the easy terrain, and I figured, why not? If there was nothing to fear, what did I have to lose? The stories are just stories, right? I wish I hadn't been so cocky. I set up camp just before dusk, a little deeper in than I usually go. The woods felt different. Even though it was just the edge of Black Pines, the air was heavier. The trees seemed too close together, their branches twisted like arthritic fingers, black against the fading sky. But I told myself it was just nerves. First-time jitters in an unfamiliar spot. The first hour was fine. I cooked dinner over the fire, listened to the crackle of the flames, watched the stars peek through the thick canopy. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. It began with the wind, or what I thought was wind. A low, steady rustling like the trees were whispering to each other. But there was no breeze. The air was completely still. I paused, fork halfway to my mouth, straining to hear. The sound was growing, surrounding me, like dozens of voices murmuring just out of earshot. Then I heard the laughter. It was faint at first, like a child giggling in the distance. I stood up, staring into the blackness beyond my campfire, squinting into the dense line of trees. Nothing. Just the endless dark. I should have packed up right then and there. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I convinced myself it was just an echo, maybe a group of hikers messing around somewhere far off. But it wasn't. As the night wore on, the laughter got louder, sharper. It was coming from different directions now. One moment to the left, the next right behind me, and that wasn't the worst part. It was starting to sound closer. Not children, not hikers. Something else. I doused the fire, plunging myself into the cold dark, hoping that whatever was out there would leave me alone if I was quiet enough. But the voices didn't stop. Instead, they multiplied. Whispers that weren't mine, soft and low, like someone or something was right behind me. I could hear breathing, ragged and slow. I stayed perfectly still, heart pounding in my chest, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to see whatever was making those sounds. And then it spoke. "Come closer." I froze. My blood ran cold as the voice echoed through the trees. It wasn't distant anymore. It was right next to my ear, low, gravelly, dripping with malice, and worse, it sounded like me. Like my own voice, distorted, twisted into something foul. "Come closer." I whipped around, my flashlight shaking in my hand, finally clicking it on. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating nothing but branches and leaves. But I knew something was out there. I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting for me to make the wrong move. The laughter came again, louder this time, closer, and then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, impossibly tall, and thin. Its limbs were too long, its head slightly tilted, as if it was studying me. The darkness clung to it like a shadow, hiding its features. But its eyes... God, its eyes... They glowed faintly, reflecting the beam of my flashlight. I couldn't tell if they were human, but I knew they weren't friendly. The thing took a step forward, moving with an unnatural grace. It didn't make a sound, not even a crunch of leaves beneath its feet. I stumbled back, heart racing, legs trembling. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't obey. And then it spoke again, in my voice, perfectly, mocking. "Don't leave. Stay." It smiled. I could see its teeth now, sharp and white, gleaming in the darkness like knives. They were too long for its mouth, like they had been crammed into a space too small for them. I ran. I didn't care where, didn't care if I tripped over rocks or branches. I just needed to get out. But as I sprinted through the woods, I realized something horrifying. The footsteps behind me weren't mine. Whatever it was fast. I could hear it gaining on me, its laughter rising, twisting, becoming something unholy. It sounded like a chorus of voices, all using my voice, mimicking me, laughing, screaming, calling for help. And then, through the madness, I heard my own voice call out from behind me. The real me. "Don't run." I didn't stop. Couldn't. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept going. I could hear the thing closing in, feel its cold breath on the back of my neck. I was almost out of the woods when it happened. The sound of my own voice, but this time right in front of me. "Help me." I froze. For a split second I saw it again, standing just beyond the tree line, grinning with those awful teeth. But this time, it had my face. I collapsed on the other side of the forest, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my ears. When I finally looked back, it was gone. The woods were silent again, as if nothing had ever happened. I'm not going back in there. I don't care what anyone says or what I left behind. Something's out there in black pines. Something that wears your face, steals your voice, and waits for you to come close enough to take you. And when it does, no one ever finds your body. No one even remembers you were there. I've always enjoyed camping, but I usually go with friends. This time I decided to challenge myself and go solo. It wasn't something I thought too much about. Just me, my gear, and a few days in the wilderness to clear my head. I found a place I'd never been before, a remote area known as Deadwood Ridge. It wasn't exactly popular, which was perfect for someone wanting to get away from the world for a while. The hike in was peaceful enough. The trail was overgrown, barely visible in places, but I'd expected that. The deeper I went into the forest, the older it felt. The trees were massive, gnarled things, their bark dark and cracked, covered in moss. And the silence, well, I'd been in quiet woods before, but this was different. There was no sound, no birds, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Just stillness. I shrugged it off. Sometimes forests were like that, especially in the fall. Maybe the animals were further out, away from where I was heading. Either way, I didn't let it bother me. I set up camp near a small stream about a mile off the trail. The sun was setting, casting a faint golden light through the trees. It would have been beautiful, if not for that strange feeling of isolation that crept up on me. As the night fell, I built a small fire, sat down with my food, and enjoyed the quiet. The stars were out, faintly visible through the thick canopy of leaves above. I felt a little on edge, but that was natural when you're alone, right? I figured I'd settle down once I got used to the stillness. A few hours passed, and the fire burned low. That's when I heard it. A faint sound in the distance. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible. A rustling, like someone, or something, moving through the trees. I paused, listening carefully. Maybe it was a deer or some other animal coming closer to the stream for water. I tried to convince myself that's all it was. But then I realized it wasn't just rustling. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and coming toward me. I stood up, my heart racing, shining my flashlight into the trees. "Hello?" I called, though the word felt weak in the stillness. "Is anyone there?" No response. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was quiet again. The only sound was the crackling of the dying fire. I stood there, my flashlight beam sweeping across the dense trees, catching nothing but shadows. After a while, I convinced myself it was nothing. The forest was playing tricks on me, I reasoned. That kind of thing happens when you're alone for too long. So I settled back down by the fire and let it burn out, retreating to my tent. But the unease didn't go away. I lay there in my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the strange feeling that something was watching me. I told myself it was just the solitude, an overactive imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't as alone as I had thought. My eyes were just starting to close when I heard it again. Footsteps. This time they were closer, much closer. They circled the tent slowly, as if whoever or whatever was outside was deliberately taking its time. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, every instinct in my body screaming for me to stay still, to not make a sound. The footsteps stopped directly outside the entrance to my tent. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat thundering in my ears. I reached for the knife I kept in my pack, clutching it tightly, though I wasn't sure what good it would do. Then, without warning, the tent shifted. Someone was pressing against it from the outside, running their hand along the fabric, tracing slow circles. My mouth went dry as I watched the shape move, pressing against the thin layer of nylon between me and whoever or whatever was out there. I held my breath, waiting, hoping it would go away. But then the zipper on my tent began to slide open, slowly, agonizingly slow. I couldn't move, frozen in terror as the zipper inched its way down. The flap opened slightly, and I was staring into the pitch-black night outside. For a long moment, nothing happened. There was only silence and the open tent flap. Then I saw it, a face, pale, almost gray, with eyes that were wide and staring, unblinking. It was just there, peering into the tent, watching me. The eyes were empty, vacant, but somehow filled with an unnatural intent. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I lunged forward, shoving the flap closed, yanking the zipper up as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get it to seal. The moment I did, I heard the footsteps again, faster this time, retreating into the woods. I sat there in the dark, clutching my knife, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. It had to be a hallucination. Maybe I was more exhausted than I thought. But the face, the eyes, those were real. They were burned into my mind. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, every creak of branches made my heart race. I waited for the footsteps to return, but they didn't. Eventually, dawn broke, casting a pale light over the forest. The mist that had clung to the ground all night was still thick, swirling lazily around the trees. I packed up my camp as fast as I could, throwing everything into my pack without bothering to organize it. I just wanted to leave, to get out of that place. As I started back toward the trail, I felt it again, that sense of being watched. Halfway through the hike, I found something that made my blood run cold. In the mud just off the trail were footprints, bare human footprints. They weren't mine. They were smaller, more delicate, like a woman's, and they weren't fresh. They were old, partially filled in by rain, but still visible. They led off the trail and into the woods, disappearing into the mist. I didn't stop to investigate. I didn't care to know where they led or who or what had made them. I just kept walking, faster, not stopping until I reached my car and sped away from Deadwood Ridge. It's been weeks now, and I still can't shake the feeling that something followed me out of that forest. Sometimes at night, I hear footsteps outside my window. Slow, deliberate. But when I look, there's no one there, just a faint mist swirling in the air. I had always been skeptical of the stories. You know the ones, the local legends that sound just ridiculous enough to be real, but you laugh them off anyway. The kind where someone claims a stretch of woods is haunted, or that something unnatural lives out there, waiting for the next fool to wander too far off the trail. I heard those stories growing up about the Hollow Pines, a dense forest about a 2-hour drive from my hometown. People said if you camped out there, you might hear voices calling to you in the night. No one ever claimed they saw anything, just the voices. I didn't believe it. Why would I? But when my buddies canceled on our annual camping trip at the last minute, I figured it was as good a time as any to check it out. Go to the Hollow Pines, camp for a night, and come back with nothing to show but a few mosquito bites and maybe a good story to make fun of the locals. I told myself I'd spend the weekend fishing, hiking, and enjoying the peace that only comes from being miles away from civilization. The first sign that something wasn't right should have been the weather. The forecast had called for clear skies, but as I neared the forest, clouds rolled in like a heavy, dark curtain. By the time I parked at the trailhead, the air felt charged, like the sky itself was holding its breath. I shrugged it off. Summer storms come and go, nothing unusual. I hiked in about 3 miles and found a nice clearing to set up camp. The woods were quiet, a bit too quiet if I'm being honest. There were no bird calls, no rustling in the bushes. Even the wind seemed muted, the tall pines standing deathly still around me. But again, I didn't think much of it. I just chalked it up to the eerie reputation of the place getting into my head. By the time I set up camp and got a fire going, the clouds had thickened, but no rain had come. The air felt thick and heavy, like something was pressing down on me, but I ignored the creeping unease building in my chest. I was here to relax, not get spooked by some ghost story. As night fell, the silence deepened. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows over the trees. I sat there listening to the stillness, letting my mind wander. Hours passed like this, my only company the crackling fire and the oppressive weight of the woods around me. Then I heard it. It started faint, almost imperceptible, a soft, distant hum like the wind through the trees, only there was no wind. I strained to listen, thinking it might be the sound of a stream or something else natural. But as it grew closer, I realized it wasn't water. It was a voice. A woman's voice. It was soft at first, barely more than a whisper, drifting through the trees like smoke. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but the tone was unmistakable, calling, beckoning. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, and I scanned the darkness. The voice sounded far off, somewhere deep in the trees. It felt like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I grabbed my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the tree line, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. No movement, no sign of anyone. "Hello?" I called, feeling a bit ridiculous. "Is someone there?" No answer, just that same soft voice calling again, this time closer. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I wasn't about to let some pranksters mess with me. Maybe some locals had come out here to scare me, Knowing the stories of the Hollow Pines, I wasn't falling for it. I stood there for a moment, considering my options. I could stay in the safety of my camp, or I could investigate and prove to myself that there was nothing out there. Of course, I chose the latter. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the source of the voice, moving slowly through the trees. The further I walked, the louder it became, but no less strange. The tone was so soft, so sweet, like someone singing just beneath their breath, just out of reach. And then it would stop, leaving nothing but silence behind. After about 10 minutes, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The voice wasn't leading me anywhere. It was circling me. No matter which direction I turned, it always sounded like it was just beyond the trees, just out of sight, but never in one place. I felt my skin prickle as dread settled in my gut. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I turned back, trying to retrace my steps to camp, but something was wrong. The trail had changed. The trees seemed closer now, packed tighter together, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands. Every path I took led me back to the same place, deeper into the woods, further from the clearing where my campfire had been. That's when I saw it. A figure, just beyond the trees, standing in the faint light of my dying flashlight, was a woman. Her back was turned to me, her head bowed, her long hair hanging down in a matted curtain. She stood there, perfectly still, like a statue among the trees. "Hey!" I called, my voice trembling. "Do you need help?" She didn't move. Didn't even acknowledge I had spoken. Just stood there, completely motionless. My gut screamed at me to run, but I found myself rooted to the spot, unable to look away. Then slowly she turned, her face. There was nothing there, no eyes, no mouth, just a blank, pale surface where a face should have been. And yet I swear I could still hear the voice, the soft, beckoning call, coming from her, even though she had no mouth to speak. My legs moved before my mind did. I ran, crashing through the underbrush, my breath ragged and my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know where I was going, just away from that thing, that impossible, horrible thing. I ran until my legs ached, until I could barely breathe. Eventually, I stumbled out into the clearing where I had set up camp, the embers of my fire still glowing faintly. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, refusing to look back. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire watching the tree line, waiting for any sign of movement, any hint of that voice returning. But it didn't. As soon as dawn broke, I packed up and left. The entire hike back to the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for me to slip up and fall back into the trees. I've told this story a few times and no one ever believes me. They laugh it off, say I must have imagined it, that it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But I know what I heard, what I saw. The Hollow Pines are real, and whatever lives in those woods is still there, waiting for the next camper to listen to the call. I had always wanted to camp alone. There's something about the idea of solitude in nature, just you and the wilderness, that had always appealed to me. No distractions, no obligations, just silence and space to think. So, when I finally had a free weekend, I packed my gear and headed deep into the mountains for a solo camping trip. I found the perfect spot, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a crystal-clear stream running nearby. There was no one for miles, and the closest town was nearly 2 hours away by car. It was exactly what I wanted, just me, the woods, and the stars. Setting up camp was easy enough, and by the time I had pitched my tent and gathered some firewood, the sun was starting to set. The temperature dropped fast as the last light of day disappeared behind the tree line, but the fire I built was warm, crackling softly as I sat beside it with a cup of coffee. I leaned back in my camping chair, letting the sounds of the forest wash over me. But that's the thing, I didn't hear much. It was quiet, too quiet. The usual chorus of forest sounds, birds, insects, the rustling of leaves, was absent. Just the occasional breeze through the trees and the steady murmur of the stream nearby. At first, it didn't bother me. I figured the quiet was part of the remote beauty of the place. But as the night wore on, the silence grew heavier, more oppressive. After finishing my coffee, I decided to walk down to the stream to fill my water bottle. I grabbed my flashlight and headed off into the dark. The beam of light cut through the blackness, illuminating the narrow path that led from my campsite to the stream. As I walked, I noticed how unnaturally still everything was. No wind, no animals, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt. I knelt by the stream, the water cold and clear, reflecting the moonlight. I filled the bottle and was about to stand up when something caught my eye. Movement in the reflection. I froze. It was faint, but there was definitely something in the water's surface. It looked like the shape of a person standing a few yards behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I spun around, shining the flashlight into the darkness behind me. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I turned back to the water, my pulse still racing. The reflection was gone. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the sudden fear. "You're just imagining things," I whispered to myself, chalking it up to the isolation messing with my mind. I quickly made my way back to camp, feeling uneasy but trying to stay calm. Back at the fire, I forced myself to relax. It was just the forest playing tricks on me, I thought. There was nothing out there. Still, the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. The shadows around the campfire seemed to stretch farther than they should, shifting and swaying in the flickering light. That's when I heard the first noise. A soft crack, like a twig snapping underfoot, came from the trees just beyond the edge of my campsite. I tensed up, shining my flashlight toward the sound. The beam revealed nothing, just trees standing tall in the dark. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but the unease clawed at my stomach. I turned off the flashlight, hoping to let the firelight bring back some comfort. It didn't. Another crack, closer this time. I stood up, gripping the flashlight tighter. The fire popped and crackled, but beyond it, the night was thick and silent again. I swept the flashlight across the tree line, my breath quickening. My heart pounded in my ears as I strained to see anything moving in the shadows. And then I saw it. 2 eyes, reflecting the light back at me from the trees, just beyond the reach of the fire's glow. They were still, unblinking, watching me. My throat tightened. I couldn't move. The eyes didn't blink, didn't shift. They just stared, locked onto me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I tried to call out, but my voice died in my throat. What could I even say? What was there to say? I didn't know what was out there. Maybe an animal, I told myself again. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The eyes were too high off the ground, too still, too focused. I swallowed hard and slowly backed toward my tent, never taking my eyes off those glowing orbs. As I reached the flap of the tent, I fumbled for the zipper, my hand shaking. And just like that, the eyes vanished. One blink, and they were gone. I stood frozen, scanning the forest with my flashlight, but there was no trace of them, no movement, no sound, just the eerie silence of the woods pressing in on me. I hurried into the tent, zipping it up as fast as I could. My breathing was shallow, and I could hear my heartbeat thudding in my ears. I crawled into my sleeping bag, clutching the flashlight like a weapon, my eyes fixed on the tent's door. For hours I lay there, listening, waiting for some sign that whatever was out there had left. But I heard nothing. No footsteps, no rustling, just that same oppressive silence. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. I woke up at dawn, the light streaming through the tent's fabric. I lay there for a moment, the events of the night before feeling distant, like a bad dream. But when I stepped outside, I knew it hadn't been a dream. The campsite was wrong. The fire pit had been disturbed, rocks overturned, ashes scattered, and my gear, which I had neatly arranged the night before, was strewn across the clearing. But the worst part was the footprints, and they weren't mine. They weren't animal tracks either. They were human, barefoot, leading from the edge of the forest, right up to the tent, and then back into the woods. I stared at them, my mind racing. Someone had been here, watching me, moving through my campsite while I slept. I didn't wait. I packed up my gear in a hurry, my hands trembling, my heart still pounding in my chest. Within minutes I was hiking back to the car, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sending my nerves on edge. I never looked back at the clearing. I haven't been camping since, but sometimes in the quiet moments late at night I think about those eyes, staring at me from the darkness, watching, waiting. And I wonder who, or what, was out there that night, and why they let me leave. It was supposed to be a weekend away from everything, the noise of the city, the endless emails, the suffocating pressure of daily life. I had always loved the idea of camping, of being out in the wild, surrounded by nothing but the towering trees and the open sky. It was freeing. Or at least it used to be. I'd never camped alone before, but when my friend Dave canceled last minute, something in me snapped. I'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks, and I wasn't about to let his flakiness ruin it. So I packed up my gear, loaded up the car, and drove deep into the mountains. I wasn't about to let fear or isolation get in my way. The road narrowed as I climbed higher into the forest, the trees crowding closer on either side. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was already starting to sink behind the jagged peaks, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I grabbed my backpack, took a deep breath of the cool mountain air, and headed into the woods. The first few hours were peaceful, even serene. The distant sound of a stream rushing somewhere to my left, the whisper of the wind through the pine needles. It felt like I had stepped into a different world, a better world. But as night began to fall, that sense of peace started to wane. The forest became darker, the towering trees like black sentinels looming over me. The birds stopped singing. I could hear every twig snap under my boots. Every breath I took seemed too loud. Still, I pressed on, eager to reach the spot I'd scouted on a hiking trip months ago, a small clearing near a lake. By the time I arrived, it was full dark. The moon, half hidden by clouds, barely lit the ground. My headlamp flickered as I set up camp, casting eerie, jittering shadows across the trees. The forest felt different now, more alive in some strange, unsettling way. Every rustle of the leaves, every creak of the branches seemed amplified, and my pulse quickened without me even realizing it. I tried to tell myself it was just nerves, being out here alone. I'd get the fire going, cook some dinner, and relax. That's what I kept telling myself. But the fire wasn't enough. As I sat there, poking at the flames, I realized just how quiet the woods had become. It wasn't just that the birds had gone silent. There was no wind, no rustle, no movement at all, just the sound of my breathing. And then, something else. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, a distant crunching sound like something walking through the underbrush. I froze, my hand gripping the fire poker. My eyes scanned the edge of the clearing, but my headlamp beam bounced uselessly off the trees, illuminating nothing but darkness. Probably just a deer, I muttered under my breath, but even saying it out loud didn't convince me. The sound stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time. Crunch. Crunch. I stood up, shining my light into the woods, but all I saw was the thick wall of black trees. The noise stopped again, but my heart was hammering in my chest. I swallowed hard and forced a laugh. Get it together, man. You're alone out here. There's nothing. Crunch. Right behind me. I spun around, the light from my headlamp sweeping over the trees, the bushes. Nothing. But I swear, I felt it. Something standing there, watching me. The fire crackled behind me, but the heat felt too far away, like it was barely keeping the night at bay. That's when I heard the whisper, a soft, breathy sound almost like a sigh. It came from the trees, low and shivering, just on the edge of hearing. Leave. I froze. My blood ran cold. The word had been so quiet, I almost thought I imagined it. but I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. My instinct was to run, to grab my pack, douse the fire, and bolt back down the trail. But my legs wouldn't move. I felt rooted in place, paralyzed by the unseen presence all around me. And then, the whisper came again. Clearer this time, closer. Go, before it sees you. I stumbled back toward the fire, my hands shaking as I grabbed for my water bottle to douse the flames. But before I could pour it, the fire flickered and went out. Just like that. I was plunged into darkness, the weak beam from my headlamp barely illuminating more than a few feet in front of me. My breath was coming in shallow, rapid gasps now, my mind racing for an explanation, any explanation. Then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of my light, something moved. A tall, shadowy figure, barely more than a silhouette against the trees. Its shape was wrong, too long, too thin, and it swayed, almost like it was trying to blend into the trunks behind it. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't listen. It was like I was in a nightmare, where every movement felt like I was wading through molasses. The figure took a step forward, and in that moment I realized something terrible. It wasn't a person. It was never a person. The shape was too fluid, too dark, like it was made of the shadows themselves. Suddenly the whisper was in my ear again, louder this time, insistent. You shouldn't have come here. I bolted. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. I ran through the forest, branches slapping at my face, tripping over roots and rocks. The darkness was suffocating, and every time I glanced back I saw that figure, always the same distance behind me, always moving just beyond the reach of my light. I didn't stop running until I burst out onto the trailhead, gasping for breath. My car was there, just where I'd left it. I scrambled for the keys, fumbling in my pocket, and when I finally got inside and slammed the door shut, I didn't stop to look back. I drove for miles, not daring to stop until I reached the small town at the base of the mountains. It wasn't until I was sitting in the parking lot of some rundown diner, trying to calm my shaking hands, that I saw it. There in the backseat mirror, a shape, hunched and tall, barely visible in the darkness, sitting in the back seat, waiting. I never made it home. I've been a park ranger for almost 7 years now. The vast, untamed wilderness has always been my second home. But there's one patch of forest that I dread, a place where the trees seem to breathe, where the night feels heavier, as if something ancient stirs in the darkness. It's called Black Pine Woods, a stretch of forest so thick that sunlight barely filters through the canopy during the day, and at night, it becomes a different world entirely. It was late October when I was assigned to patrol Black Pine. The other rangers joked about the place, calling it the Silent Zone, because the wildlife rarely made a sound there. I dismissed their banter at first. The forest is the forest. It's wild, unpredictable. That's what I told myself anyway. I arrived at the ranger station near dusk, the sky turning blood red as the sun slipped behind the trees. The air was still, unnaturally so, with no wind to rustle the leaves. I grabbed my gear, checked the radio, nothing but static, and set out to cover the northern trail. The walk was uneventful at first, but as night fell, the woods transformed. The usual sounds of the forest, the distant hoots of owls, the rustling of small animals, were absent. It was dead quiet, save for my own footsteps crunching against the underbrush. I kept my flashlight close, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. That's when I saw it, a figure standing between two trees about 30 yards ahead. I froze, thinking maybe it was a lost hiker. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. No answer. The figure didn't move, just stood there, hunched over, arms dangling unnaturally low. My pulse quickened. I shone the light directly on it. The figure vanished, gone without a sound, as if it had never been there. I blinked, my heart hammering in my chest. Maybe it was a trick of the light, I thought. Shadows can play tricks on the mind out here. I kept walking, though a gnawing unease settled into my bones. A few minutes later I heard it, a low, guttural growl. It wasn't like any animal I'd heard before, more primal, almost human. I swept the flashlight in the direction of the sound. The light caught something. 2 glowing eyes, reflecting the beam back at me from the darkness. They were too high up to belong to any animal I knew of. I backed up slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The eyes disappeared, but I could hear movement, something large circling me in the trees, staying just out of sight. I didn't run. Running would make me prey. Instead, I kept moving, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, never left. I reached a clearing and took a breath, relieved to be out of the thick brush. But the feeling of safety was short-lived. On the other side of the clearing, there was something wrong. A dead deer lay on the ground, its body twisted in ways that defied logic. Its head was turned completely around, and its legs bent backward. Worse, strange symbols were carved into the animal's flesh. Symbols I didn't recognize, but they filled me with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. That's when I heard the whisper, a voice, faint, carried on the still air, though I couldn't make out the words. It was coming from the trees, but the source was nowhere in sight. Then, the whispering stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and too heavy to be human. I spun around, expecting to see the source of the sound, but there was nothing. My heart pounded in my ears, and every instinct screamed at me to leave. I radioed the station, but it was still nothing but static. As I turned to head back, the footsteps started again, closer this time, right behind me. I swung the flashlight around, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a creature, taller than any man, its body covered in dark, matted fur. But it wasn't a bear. Its face, I can barely describe it. It looked like a wolf, but twisted, its eyes too large, too human, and its mouth. It smiled, lips pulling back to reveal rows of jagged yellow teeth. But that wasn't the worst part. It stood on 2 legs. Before I could react, it took a step forward, its bones creaking with the motion, as if they didn't quite fit under its skin. My body locked up in terror, and I stumbled backward, falling hard onto the forest floor. It moved closer, its breath hot and rancid on the air. And for a moment, I thought, this was it. That this thing would tear me apart, right here in the middle of Black Pine Woods. But it stopped. It cocked its head to the side as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Then it turned and walked back into the darkness without a sound. I lay there, shaking, trying to comprehend what I'd just seen. That's when the whispering returned, louder this time, almost frantic. I forced myself up and bolted back toward the station, running blindly through the trees. The whispering followed me, growing louder, more insistent, until it felt like the voices were inside my head, pushing against my skull. When I finally reached the station, I collapsed inside, slamming the door behind me. I locked it, breathing hard, trying to calm down. But then, I heard something behind me, a low creak of wood, like something shifting. I turned slowly, and my heart nearly stopped. There, standing just inside the window, was my own reflection, but it wasn't me. It had the same face, the same uniform, but its eyes were wrong. They were too large, too human, and it was smiling. That's when I realized I never made it out of those woods. I'm still there somewhere, lost in the darkness, and whatever's in here with me, it's wearing my face.